If you've ever dreamed of living in a grand medieval castle perched on a hilltop, flags fluttering in the breeze, a cozy fire roaring in the great hall, then congratulations, you've officially bought into one of history's most uncomfortable lies, because medieval castles weren't built to be homes, they were built to be fortresses. In fact, calling them homes is like calling a prison a rustic Airbnb. The primary goal wasn't comfort or style or even basic human warmth, it was defense. Castles were the military tanks of the 11th century, just with more stone and fewer cup holders. Hello, travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Tonight, we will explore the topic why medieval castles were a giant stone disappointment and many more. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Let's start with the moat, a feature that looks dramatic in paintings and seems like a lovely way to discourage door-to-door salesmen. But in reality, moats weren't just aesthetic water features. They were giant muddy ditches, often filled with sewage and refuse that made sure nobody could get close to your walls without needing a tetanus shot. You couldn't even stroll across your own front yard without lowering the drawbridge, a mechanism specifically designed to keep everyone, including you, out. Want to run to the medieval equivalent of a corner shop? Too bad, Jeff, drawbridge is up. Then we have arrow slits, those narrow vertical openings in the walls that let archers shoot out without getting shot in. They're clever, effective, and give the castle a distinct murdery aesthetic. Just don't expect much of a view from inside. Arrow slits are not the kind of window you want to lean out of with your morning tea, unless you're hoping to flash a medieval sniper. And of course there's the portcullis, a giant spiked gate that drops down to block the entrance. It's basically a medieval garage door with rage issues. In a siege it could slam shut in seconds. In peacetime, it still kind of loomed there, a heavy metal reminder that your front door could crush a cow. All of this served a clear purpose: keep attackers out, which worked, except when it also kept the residents trapped inside. During long sieges, you weren't enjoying panoramic views and singing with birds like some medieval princess. You were stuck behind thick stone walls, rationing dried peas and hoping the enemy got bored. And if you think modern family gatherings are stressful, imagine being trapped with your in-laws for 6 months, no Wi-Fi, no deodorant, and just one barrel of ale between 13 people. You might be wondering, why not build a castle with both defense and comfort in mind? Well, the answer is simple. Comfort didn't win wars. A plush pillow never stopped a battering ram, so while the nobility might have added some decorative flair, tapestries, carved staircases, the occasional gold goblet, the heart of the castle remained a military installation, one that was cold, cramped, and more concerned with pouring boiling oil on enemies than making sure your soup was the right temperature. Because really, nothing says welcome home like a boiling cauldron of oil above the door. So you've just moved into your medieval castle. Congratulations, you're now the proud resident of a multi-ton refrigerator made entirely of damp stone. There are no windows, no central heating, and the last time someone invented insulation was never. But hey, at least you're safe from intruders, right? Right? Now let's talk about temperature, or rather the total and utter lack of it. Castles were cold. Not grab a blanket cold. Not put on another sweater cold. We're talking about the kind of cold that makes your soul shiver and your eyebrows frost over during dinner. Imagine trying to fall asleep while your breath fogs up in front of your face and your chamber pot develops a thin layer of ice. Welcome to the Middle Ages. Let's start with the walls. Castle walls were built from solid stone, sometimes up to 10 feet thick. That's excellent news if you're worried about a Viking invasion, but terrible news if you like feeling your toes. Stone isn't just bad at trapping heat. It actively sucks it out of the room like a medieval energy vampire. The thicker the walls, the colder it stayed inside, especially in winter. And let's not forget that most rooms had no ceiling insulation. The wind could whistle right through the rafters like it was auditioning for a ghost story. What about fireplaces, you ask? Oh, castles had fireplaces. Enormous, cavernous things you could roast a sheep in if you had one, but functionally, they were about as efficient as heating your room by setting a birthday candle on fire and shouting words of encouragement. Most of the heat from a medieval fireplace went straight up the chimney, along with your hopes, dreams, and any chance of having feeling in your fingers. If you sat directly in front of the fire, you might toast your knees, but your back would still be plotting your hypothermia, and that's if you had a fireplace. In many castles, only the great hall, the giant communal space used for eating, entertaining, and suffering together, had a proper fire. If you were lucky, your personal chamber might have a small hearth. If you were unlucky, your heating system consisted of the body heat from your sleeping servant huddled at your feet and a few mouldy furs that smelled like last year's hunting accident. Then there's the problem of airflow, or more specifically the medieval solution to it. None. Most windows were simply open gaps in the wall, perfect for letting in fresh air, which, spoiler alert, was usually freezing. Later, wealthier castles added glass windows, but before that the best you could hope for was a bit of waxed cloth or a wooden shutter. These did wonders for blocking the wind and precisely nothing for letting in light. On cold days, your options were keep the shutters open and freeze, or shut them tight and stumble around your own home like you were blindfolded, and don't even think about complaining. Because medieval solutions to cold weren't exactly sophisticated. Instead of installing better chimneys or sealing off rooms, the answer was usually just more bodies. Invite your knights, your cousins, your baker, and that weird guy who lives near the stables. If enough people gather in one room, the sheer mass of warm human misery might raise the temperature by 0.5 degree. Cozy, right? Still not warm enough? Well then you hang a tapestry, yes. Medieval people decorated their walls with large, heavy woven art, not because they had an eye for interior design, but because fabric was one of the few things that could provide even a whisper of insulation. These weren't just decorations of unicorns prancing through forests, though yes, those existed. They were the medieval equivalent of stapling a blanket to your living room wall and calling it architecture. And don't forget your bed. 4-poster beds with heavy curtains were all the rage. Not to look regal, but to trap any escaping heat like it owed them rent. People slept fully dressed, often under furs, wool, and sometimes even straw mattresses stuffed with hay or feathers. You wrapped yourself up like a burrito and hoped to wake up without frostbite. And if you thought you might feel warmer cuddling with someone else, sure, go ahead. Just know that personal hygiene was optional, and bedbugs were frequent guests. So yes, the good news? Your castle won't burn down. The bad news? You'll freeze long before that matters, and if you do manage to survive until spring, you'll emerge from your stone igloo with a newfound appreciation for modern miracles like insulation, radiators, and not dying of hypothermia in your own dining room. Imagine walking into your grand medieval castle after a long day of surviving archers, plague, and family gathering. You crave nothing more than to collapse into a soft chair and relax. The only problem? That chair doesn't exist, and neither does anything else designed with human anatomy in mind, because medieval furniture was less about comfort and more about proving you had a spine strong enough to survive both battle and sitting down. Let's begin with the bench, the workhorse of the medieval seating world. Benches were everywhere, long, narrow, and entirely uninterested in the curve of your back or the fate of your tailbone. These things were made from raw, heavy timber, with about as much give as a cathedral door. You either sat like a stiff plank or slid off entirely. There were no armrests, no padding, and definitely no lumbar support. The concept of ergonomic design wouldn't be invented for centuries, and in the meantime your job was to sit down and suffer like a noble. Of course, if you were wealthy or important enough, you might be granted a chair of estate. Now the name sounds fancy, regal, even, and visually it was impressive. These thrones were tall-backed, elaborately carved, and often placed on raised platforms to let everyone know that your bottom was more prestigious than theirs. But let's be honest, ever sit on a medieval chair? It's like hugging a tree, but the tree hates you. These chairs were solid wood and more decorative than functional. You sat on them not to relax but to intimidate. They weren't about comfort, They were about reminding people who had the fancier hemorrhoids. Then there were tables, broad, solid, and as subtle as siege engines. They were often made from thick oak slabs so wide they needed entire oxen to move them, and possibly divine intervention to clean underneath. Legs were chunky, hand-carved and prone to uneven wobbling, especially on stone floors, and don't imagine chairs neatly tucked around them like a Pinterest picnic scene. Oh no. People often stood or sat on benches along only one side of the table so that servants could serve from the other, because if there's anything more medieval than sore backs, it's deeply inconvenient seating arrangements. Beds, too, were a game of expectations versus reality. Sure, the noble four-poster bed looks luxurious in paintings, draped in rich fabric and piled high with furs, but in truth, many beds were stuffed with straw. Sometimes feathers if you were lucky, and by feathers we mean whatever didn't run off during plucking. The frame creaked, the ropes underneath sagged, and turning over felt like rearranging sacks of hay with your body. Add in the fact that mattresses were rarely cleaned, and you've got a bacteria party in a wooden box. And no, peasants didn't get these either. They slept on straw piles in the corner, like particularly tolerated livestock. Cushions, only if you were royalty. And even then it wasn't a guarantee. Cushions were rare and expensive, luxuries embroidered by hand and stuffed with wool, feathers, or if you were extremely unlucky, horsehair. Most of the time people sat on wood, ate off wood, slept on wood, and possibly dreamed of becoming trees just to fit in better. Storage was equally bleak. Chests were the all-purpose furniture item of choice. Storage unit, table, bench, and occasionally coffin. Wardrobes were virtually non-existent. People stored clothing in boxes, which makes sense considering most people only owned one outfit anyway. Shelving was minimal, and closets were unheard of. Need to store something? Congratulations, you now have a slightly bigger box. And then there was the board, yes, as in bed and board. The word board referred to a literal board of wood that was laid across trestles to serve as a table, then disassembled and removed when not in use. Why? Because most castle rooms served multiple purposes. Today it's a dining hall, tonight it's a ballroom, tomorrow it's a courtroom. Need to switch things up? Just remove the board. Instant transformation and zero comfort guaranteed. What you're left with is a furniture landscape designed not around convenience but around function, power, and pure medieval stubbornness. Furniture was a tool, not a treat. It communicated your rank, your wealth, and your pain tolerance. If it looked good but felt awful, perfect. You were now sitting on a socially reinforced metaphor. So the next time you sink into your memory foam recliner, remember this: in a medieval castle, comfort was treason, and your seat was there to remind you of two things: who's in charge, and just how much your rear end could endure in silence. Let's be honest, nothing kills the romantic fantasy of castle life faster than the moment you stop to wonder, where did everyone go to the bathroom? And if your answer was indoor plumbing, then I have some medieval news for you. In an era where hygiene was often considered suspicious, castles took an approach to sanitation that can only be described as boldly optimistic. Because while castle builders excelled at building walls, towers, and war machines, they had a less impressive track record when it came to toilets, or more accurately, the creative absence of toilets. Let's start with the infamous garderobe, a word that sounds suspiciously elegant, like it should belong in a French spa. In reality, a garderobe was a stone or wooden box with a hole in it, usually built into the exterior wall of the castle, precariously perched over open air. You sat, squatted, or hovered over that hole, and gravity handled the rest. The waste would fall straight down into a cesspit, a ditch, or in some cases directly into the castle's moat, a body of water that, despite its intimidating military reputation, was basically a glorified toilet bowl with fish, and you'd better hope no one was walking underneath. Some garderobes had multiple holes thoughtfully arranged side by side, just in case you felt like turning your medieval bathroom trip into a team-building exercise. Privacy, that was for the nobility, and even they were lucky if their personal throne had a curtain. Of course, if you weren't near a garderobe or you were in a hurry, you reached for the chamber pot, a small ceramic bowl that acted as a portable toilet. Chamber pots were used indoors, under tables, beside beds, or behind curtains. There was no designated bathroom. Every room had the potential to become one. After doing your business, the contents were flung out the window with the kind of casual disregard that would earn you a lawsuit today. Streets and courtyards often echoed with the shout of "Guard Lou," which roughly translates to "Duck, I'm about to launch something awful from above." In a bustling castle filled with nobles, servants, guards and guests, this all added up to one very pungent situation. The air was less scented with lavender and more saturated with consequences. And don't think the moat was just catching the overflow. That thing was a stew of human waste, animal carcasses, discarded food and despair. By all accounts, moat water was a biohazard filled with bacteria, parasites, and the kind of smell that could file a complaint with the king. And yet, it gets worse. In many castles, especially early ones, garderobes weren't cleaned. There was no sewer system, no flushing water, no crew of sanitation workers coming to pump anything out. Waste just built up in pits or along the base of the walls. Over time, some castles began installing chutes and rudimentary drains to move the problem elsewhere, but that elsewhere was usually just farther down the hill. Now, if you're imagining that everyone walked around covering their noses with scented cloths and tossing rose petals on the floor to mask the stench, you're only half wrong. Nobility did try to mask odors with perfumed sachets, herbs, or burning incense, but it was like putting a bandage on a decapitation. The smell didn't go away, it simply argued with the lavender. Even clothing didn't escape the bathroom situation. The garderobe was occasionally used to store robes and cloaks. Yes, near the toilet. Why? Because people believed the ammonia-rich fumes would help kill moths and lice. Congratulations, you've invented pest control via open-air sewage. Sure, your cape smells like a latrine, but at least it's moth-free. Let's also spare a thought for the poor servants who had to empty, clean and maintain these medieval biohazards. Their jobs included hauling full chamber pots down winding stone staircases without spilling a drop. An occupational hazard that could only end badly. One slip and it wasn't just your pride that got bruised. And if you thought public sanitation was any better in the surrounding towns, think again. Waste from the castle flowed downhill, both metaphorically and literally, into the homes and drinking water of peasants below. Disease ran rampant, not because people were ignorant, but because the infrastructure to do better simply didn't exist. You don't need a PhD in epidemiology to realize that when your latrine hangs over your water supply, something has gone terribly, terribly wrong. So yes, they called it a garderobe to make it sound elegant. It was a poop chute with delusions of grandeur. And the next time you flush a toilet with clean water, in a room that smells vaguely of lemon, just remember it took humanity about 1,000 years to figure out that building a moat full of excrement next to your kitchen was probably a bad idea. Let's get one thing straight. If you think medieval castles were tranquil retreats where nobles reclined on velvet cushions while listening to lutes and pondering rulers, you've been watching too many historically inaccurate costume dramas. The real soundtrack of castle life was less harp music over a candlelit dinner, and more somebody stepped on the dog while a knight dropped his sword down a staircase. Medieval castles were loud, not just occasional commotion loud. We're talking constant, unrelenting, headache-inducing cacophony, the kind of soundscape that would make a modern airport seem like a yoga retreat. It all starts with the architecture. Castles weren't built with comfort in mind. They were designed to survive sieges, repel enemies, and terrify peasants. So acoustics? Not exactly a priority. Thick stone walls, towering ceilings, and vast open halls created the perfect echo chamber. Every sound bounced around like it was trying to start its own medieval podcast. Footsteps didn't just patter, they thudded. Conversations didn't stay private, they boomed. If someone coughed in the great hall, you could probably hear it 3 floors up, and if a knight tripped over his own chainmail, it sounded like a dinner bell in hell. And since walls were made of unyielding stone and floors were rarely carpeted, Unless you count a hay bale that got lost, nothing absorbed sound. So the general rule was, if one person made a noise, everyone heard it, whether they wanted to or not. Now imagine filling that echoing stone megaphone with a couple hundred people, most of whom are yelling. Castles housed more than just a noble family and a few well-mannered guests sipping mead. No, they were crammed with an entire small civilization. You had servants scurrying around at all hours, clanking pots, shouting instructions, arguing over who forgot to refill the torches. You had guards in heavy armor stomping across the halls like metallic toddlers learning to walk. Add cooks shouting from the kitchens, scribes reading aloud, and children, noble and otherwise, practicing the art of being loudly annoying, and you've got a household that never ever shut up. And lest we forget, livestock. Yes, in many medieval castles, especially during the colder seasons or times of siege, animals were brought inside. Chickens, pigs, goats, and sometimes even cows. Not only were these animals noisy in their own right, they often didn't understand the etiquette of quiet hours. At any given moment, a rooster might be announcing his existence, a dog might be chasing that rooster through the corridor, and someone might be yelling, "Catch that rooster before the Lord sees it again," and we haven't even gotten to the militaristic side of things. Castles were, after all, military installations. That meant horns were used for announcements, not gentle bugles playing reveille. We're talking battle horns, blown with the subtlety of a foghorn on caffeine. They were used to signal everything from visitors arriving to potential invasions. Basically, if you lived in a castle and heard a horn, you didn't know if it meant dinner is served or run for your life. Training drills happened regularly too. Clashing swords, barking commands, the clanking and grinding of armor being maintained. It all happened inside the echo chamber that was your home. And forget about sleeping in. The knights practiced when they wanted, and what they lacked in skill, they made up for in volume. If you think you could simply retreat to your room for peace and quiet, think again. Rooms didn't have doors so much as they had curtains or wooden partitions. Sound traveled through them like it had front row tickets. Privacy was a myth, and the moment someone sneezed downstairs, you were somehow part of it. And because many castle dwellers shared sleeping spaces, sometimes dozens in a single hall, even bedtime wasn't silent. Imagine falling asleep to the lullabies of snoring knights, whispering scullery maids, a baby wailing somewhere in the distance, and that same rooster still being mad about everything. The great hall was the beating heart and bleeding ears of the castle. This is where everyone gathered to eat, plan, gossip, argue, and occasionally throw things. During banquets, the volume reached thunderous proportions. Jesters performed loudly, guests laughed, sometimes politely, sometimes drunkenly, and musicians played with all the delicacy of a cat walking across a lute. It was considered festive, even regal. But if you were hoping to enjoy a meal while having a quiet conversation, you were about 800 years too early. It's no wonder that monks living in silent, echo-free monasteries seemed so serene. Meanwhile, the noble classes, supposedly the refined elite, were stomping around like caffeinated elephants in a church bell factory. Medieval castles had the acoustics of a cave and the volume of a rock concert. If everyone was yelling about turnips, if you think the worst part of dinner is overcooked pasta or the wrong sauce on your burger, let's take a medieval stroll into the castle kitchen, where culinary chaos wasn't a bug in the system, it was the system. Far from being a warm, bustling heart of the home, the average castle kitchen was more like a smoky pit of semi-controlled fire, unpredictable meat, and people yelling about eels. Let's begin with the kitchen itself. Picture an enormous stone room full of soot, smoke, and enough grease to lube a trebuchet. The centerpiece? A massive open hearth fire that roared day and night, fed by logs the size of small children and ambition. There were no thermostats, no pilot lights, and definitely no user-friendly knobs. If you wanted to cook a roast, you eyeballed the flames and hoped the pig didn't come out with one side raw and the other resembling volcanic rock. Burned fingers were a rite of passage. So were kitchen fires. Many kitchens were separated from the main castle, or at least stuck in a different wing for one reason: Fire happened so often it was safer to lose dinner than the entire castle. And here's the twist. These roaring infernos weren't there to prepare meals for a cozy family of 4. Castle kitchens often had to feed hundreds of people at a time, between the noble family, their extended relatives, an army of knights, squires, servants, guests, and at least one jester who wouldn't stop juggling fruit. The menu wasn't exactly focused on individual taste. Food was prepared in massive batches, dumped into cauldrons the size of bathtubs, stirred with what looked suspiciously like boat paddles, and served up with all the finesse of a medieval soup cannon. Quality control. Hilarious. Meat was often kept on hooks in cool reed, not warm rooms, and served when it looked okay. And when it didn't look okay, well, that's what spices were for. Spices weren't just for flavor. They were medieval Febreze for food. If your mutton was doing a little too much decomposing, a dash of cloves and vinegar could convince diners to take a bite before the smell convinced them to run. Speaking of meat, the medieval menu was heavy on it. Boar, venison, rabbit and birds of various legality, some definitely poached, were common. Fish was also big, especially during religious fasts. Eels were weirdly popular, likely because they were easy to catch, hard to kill, and confusing enough to distract you from the fact that dinner tasted like mud. If it moved and wasn't already moldy beyond recognition, into the pot it went. Vegetarian options. You mean what the peasants eat. Bread was the lifeline of every meal. But even this was a risky proposition. While noble households had access to finer flours, bread could still be gritty thanks to millstones that flaked into the flour, meaning your baguette might double as a dental hazard. And since refrigeration was centuries away from existing, leftovers either became breakfast or became compost, sometimes both at the same time. Now, you'd think food service might be refined in a castle setting, but presentation wasn't exactly on the medieval priority list. Meals arrived on enormous wooden platters or trenchers, thick slabs of stale bread used as edible plates if you were lucky. If you weren't, you got whatever hadn't collapsed on the floor or been sampled by the kitchen staff. That's assuming your food hadn't been nibbled by a passing dog, of which there were many. Hygiene rules were loose. Then there's the matter of cleanliness. Imagine raw meat being prepped next to yesterday's fish guts, with a generous side of fly traffic. Cutting boards weren't sanitized, they were wiped, if that. Dishwashing was done in cold water and elbow grease, which is a poetic way of saying mostly not done. The only thing less safe than eating the food was asking how it got made, and let's not forget the smells. A castle kitchen wasn't just the scent of roasting meat and fresh bread. It was a heady mix of smoke, blood, scorched fat, damp stone, and something unidentifiable that might have been cheese or a sock. It was hard to tell. Yet somehow, this chaos produced feasts that were celebrated for days. Roasted swan, spiced wine, sugar sculptures for the truly wealthy, and pies filled with anything from fruit to entire birds. Yes, live birds in some cases, because surprise poultry is apparently fun at parties. Food was more than sustenance, it was power, spectacle and survival rolled into one wobbly table spread. So, if you're imagining candlelit elegance with a roasted goose and silver platters, adjust your mental lens. Dinner in a medieval castle wasn't a luxurious escape. It was a daily gamble with undercooked odds and overcooked ends. Dinner wasn't a reward. It was a gamble with gravy. Welcome to medieval castle life, where your every move had an audience, and even your inner thoughts weren't safe from eavesdropping ears. If you're the kind of person who enjoys long showers, locking doors, and the sacred joy of alone time, a medieval castle would have broken you by breakfast. The concept of privacy as we know it didn't exist. In fact, if you ever found yourself alone in a room in a castle, it usually meant one of two things. You were either incredibly important or incredibly suspicious. Let's start with sleeping arrangements, because that's where things got particularly communal. For most residents of the castle, servants, guards, squires, visitors, and even some minor nobility, sleeping meant piling into shared chambers with as much personal space as a pack of sardines. Beds weren't assigned so much as vaguely claimed, and if you were lucky, You might not wake up with a snoring stable boy on one side and a drooling cook on the other. Comfort wasn't a priority, proximity was. Even nobles couldn't escape the human traffic jam. Sure, they had slightly more refined spaces, maybe a chamber of their own, perhaps even a four-poster bed with heavy curtains, but even that didn't guarantee solitude. Servants often slept on the floors of their masters' chambers, not out of affection but necessity. These loyal shadow dwellers were expected to be available at all hours, lighting fires, fetching water, helping you dress, and probably judging your snoring. Want to write a love letter? Too bad there's a footman 2 feet away polishing your armor while humming off-key. Now let's talk about the royal experience. The king, one would think, had it better, and in some ways he did. He might have an inner chamber, something marginally more private, separated by wooden partitions or rich tapestries. But private is relative when your room is also a throughway for guards, advisors, servants, and the occasional random noble who just needed a word. It wasn't uncommon for monarchs to hold court from their beds. Yes, decisions about wars, marriages, and taxes were made while wearing pajamas, or their medieval equivalent, which was usually just less itchy clothing. Tapestries were supposed to help with privacy by sectioning off parts of a room, but they weren't exactly soundproof. So if you were hoping to whisper sweet nothings to your secret lover behind the woven image of a hunting dog, you'd better keep it PG. Sound traveled, secrets didn't stay secret, and walls definitely had ears, often literal ones, as servants hid in alcoves or hovered in doorways just out of sight. Bathrooms, or the medieval lack thereof, offered no respite either. Garderobes didn't come with doors. If you were lucky, you got a curtain. If you were really lucky, no one was walking by the window when you decided to conduct your business. Castle living meant accepting that privacy was not a right, it was a momentary accident. And let's not forget the open halls and communal great rooms. Meals were a grand, noisy affair, with long tables filled with chatter, cutlery, if you were lucky enough to have any, and the occasional bit of gossip. Everyone was watching everyone. That's not paranoia, it's just medieval life. Your gestures, your clothes, your choice of food, and even how enthusiastically you chewed could be scrutinized. One wrong move and you were the subject of someone else's dinner conversation, or worse, poetry. Even love and courtship were less romantic candlelit walks and more awkward declarations with your chaperone 3 feet away. Marriage alliances were often forged under the not-so-watchful eyes of half the castle staff and several nosy relatives. Privacy in matters of the heart, only if you had the nerve to sneak behind a tapestry and the guts to deal with the rumors afterward. In short, living in a medieval castle was like starring in a never-ending reality show, except the drama was real, the wardrobe was itchy, and you never got to vote anyone off. People were everywhere, always, from dawn until dusk, and sometimes through the night, you were seen, heard, and rarely left alone. So the next time you slam your bedroom door, pop in your earbuds, and bask in glorious solitude, take a moment to thank your lucky stars you weren't born into the glittering stone surveillance state of medieval nobility, because in that world, the only true privacy was in your head, and even then, only if you whispered. You'd think that with all those stone walls, massive towers, and intimidating drawbridges, medieval castles would have been fortresses of permanence, immovable, indestructible, and basically the ancient version of a forever home. But in reality, castles were in a constant state of construction, repair, decay, and mild existential crisis. The phrase finished castle was about as believable as a unicorn on a tax form, because by the time a castle was complete, it was already falling apart. Let's start with the materials. Stone might sound eternal, but not when it's being battered by centuries of rain, wind, and invading armies. Mortar crumbled, masonry cracked, and towers leaned a little more dramatically with each passing winter. And when wood was involved, stairs, floors, scaffolding, roofing beams, it wasn't a question of if it would rot, but how fast. Add in the occasional fire, which was as common as cold stew, and you've got a building held together by stubbornness and medieval optimism. Roofs were especially problematic. Medieval roofing was less weatherproof and more weather-suggestive. If you wanted to know whether it was raining outside, you didn't need to open a window, you just waited for the steady drip onto your bedchamber floor. Tiles would blow away, thatch would rot, and wooden beams would sag like a disappointed relative. Repairing a roof required ladders, labourers, and an acceptance that the fix would last maybe until the next thunderstorm. Even castles built entirely of stone had wooden interior elements: floors, ceilings, galleries, furniture, supports and stairs. All of them were vulnerable to moisture, pests and time. And nothing says regal sophistication quite like watching your hallway floor collapse into the wine cellar below. Surprise renovations were a part of daily life. Then there was the simple fact that castles were never really finished. Construction on a new castle could take decades or centuries, or in some cases it just kind of stopped when the funding ran out or the owner died in battle. King Edward I, for instance, started building Beaumaris Castle in Wales in 1295. It was abandoned, unfinished, in 1330. That's 35 years of planning, digging, hauling and stacking rocks, only to leave it looking like someone rage-quit a giant game of Minecraft. The real problem was that construction wasn't just about building, it was also about defending. If your castle was under construction during wartime, which it often was, you had to pause for a siege, a fire, or a group of uninvited guests with battering rams. Work would stop, scaffolding would get knocked over, and when the dust cleared, the repairs would start again, assuming your masons hadn't joined the other side for better wages. Speaking of labour, maintaining a castle required an army of its own. There were stonemasons, carpenters, blacksmiths, glaziers, ditch diggers, roofers and water carriers. Many castles employed a permanent building staff because something always needed fixing. A door was warped, a staircase had collapsed, a tower was sinking into a suspiciously mushy bit of earth. The phrase, "we'll patch it tomorrow," was basically the medieval version of a lifestyle. And because every lord wanted to outcastle the next guy, renovations were constant. Let's add another turret. We need a second moat. The west wall should have bigger murder holes. These vanity projects meant that no sooner was one part of the castle patched than another was being torn down to make space for something flashier. Building wasn't just survival, it was status. Some castles were even designed to be unfinished. The idea was to start with a grand show of construction, maybe a gatehouse or a ceremonial hall, and then stop once the neighbours got jealous or the treasury got suspiciously empty. It was less build your dream home, and more build just enough to pretend you could afford the dream home. Oh, and let's not forget the glorious inconvenience of medieval logistics, hauling massive stones from quarries, shipping timber from distant forests, or forging iron hinges by hand wasn't exactly fast. Roads were muddy, carts broke down, and skilled labourers occasionally vanished when better jobs opened up 3 towns over. Building a castle was a masterclass in delayed gratification, and also a pretty reliable way to die before your bathroom was ever completed. So yes, castles were impressive. They were symbols of power, grandeur and military might, but behind the curtain of banners and battlements was a never-ending construction zone. Dust, noise, complaints, and the occasional collapsed staircase were simply part of the ambience. Medieval life meant living with constant repairs, drafts that could freeze a night mid-stride, and roofs that leaked more than state secrets. Castle builders didn't dream of retirement, they just hoped they'd finish the north wing before their knees gave out. If you've ever woken up because something small and hairy scurried across your foot, congratulations, you now share a life experience with most medieval castle dwellers, for all their stone grandeur and towering battlements. Castles were less palatial residence, and more luxury pest hotel with optional stabbing. Rodents, insects, and every form of winged horror from the vermin kingdom made themselves right at home. And unfortunately, they didn't just crash the party. They brought disease, discomfort, and the kind of sleep disturbances that no feather mattress could cure. Let's start with the rats, not the cute pet store kind with names like Pickle and Sir Whiskerstein, but the relentless, grimy, disease-ridden plague factories that haunted every corridor, kitchen and crevice of a castle, with cracks in the stone walls, open food storage, and a general disregard for the concept of sanitation. Rats flourished in medieval castles like influencers at a Renaissance fair. They weren't just occasional visitors, they were residents, landlords, and if you were unlucky, bedmates. These weren't just a nuisance, they were a ticking biological time bomb. Fleas thrived on rats, and in turn latched onto humans with the enthusiasm of toddlers at a candy buffet. And it was those fleas, of course, that helped launch the greatest public health disaster in European history, the Black Death. When a single flea could carry Yersinia pestis, that charming microbe responsible for the bubonic plague, it turned every rat into a potential grim reaper. Castles, with their bustling populations and cozy quarters, were prime venues for plague parties no one wanted an invite to. Fleas didn't stop at rats either. They were equal opportunity bloodsuckers. Bedding in castles was rarely, if ever, clean to anything resembling modern standards. Feathers might have filled the mattress, but so did generations of fleas, lice, and all their extended itchy family. If you lay still long enough, your bed became less of a resting place and more of a flea buffet line. And unlike visiting cousins, they never knew when to leave. Then there were lice, the scalp's tiny, unwanted tenants. Forget shampooing. The medieval solution to a lice outbreak was often to shave everyone's head and pretend baldness was a fashion statement. Lice didn't discriminate based on class either. Kings itched, queens scratched, knights combed endlessly, often with special fine-toothed devices that removed more vermin than hair. And we haven't even touched on the winged menace. Flies, drawn to open waste pits, unwashed bodies, and decaying food scraps. Flies made castle life a non-stop buzzfest. Dining in a castle hall often involved one hand on your goblet and the other swatting furiously at the air. The smell of roasting meat might have wafted through the corridors, but so did the aroma of decay and animal waste, and the flies were living their best lives. Speaking of waste, let's talk about animal infestations. Cats were occasionally kept as mouse deterrents, but even they were no match for the sheer volume of rodents scurrying through the place like tiny burglars. Bats nested in tower rafters, birds roosted in open windows, insects emerged from the wooden beams with clockwork regularity. It was like living inside a National Geographic documentary, if the documentary had a lot more screaming and less David Attenborough. The kitchens, always a favourite haunt for pests, were especially vulnerable. Open food, warm fires, and overflowing waste buckets made them a paradise for everything with wings, legs, or slime trails. Bread was stored in cupboards that doubled as ant colonies, grain bins could erupt in weevils, and meat, if you could call it that, often had a texture that wasn't entirely due to spice rub. Imagine cooking stew while a rat makes a break for it across the hearth, only to fall in. Congratulations, you've accidentally invented ratatouille, the horror edition. Even your boots weren't safe. Tucking your shoes beside the bed meant you risked slipping your foot into a warm pile of fur and claws the next morning. Medieval castle dwellers quickly learned to shake out their clothes and boots before dressing, not because of fashion sense, but to avoid giving a flea family a lift to breakfast. Yet perhaps the most galling part of all this wasn't just the discomfort, it was the resignation. People knew they were sharing their space with pests, and most simply accepted it. Rats were part of the furniture, lice were an inevitability, fleas were practically emotional support animals. Everyone itched, everyone scratched, and no one was surprised. The fleas were loyal after all. They stayed with you through war, famine, and your third failed marriage. They didn't care if you were noble or peasant. All they needed was a little warmth, a little blood, and a total disregard for personal boundaries. In that way, pests might have been the most democratic force in all of medieval castle life. If you've ever fantasized about living in a medieval castle, waking up in a four-poster bed, strolling past tapestries, perhaps waving gracefully from a stone balcony while your pet falcon circles overhead, it's time for a reality check. Living in a medieval castle wasn't the glamorous Arthurian dream spun by fairy tales. It was cold, noisy, smelly, cramped, and constantly falling apart. And that was on a good day when the moat wasn't doubling as a sewage pit and your bread didn't come with bonus weevils. Let's be honest, the idea of castles has been hijacked by fairy tales, theme parks and historical fiction with a suspicious lack of lice. Castles were never designed for comfort. They were fortresses, stone-clad flexes of feudal muscle, meant to intimidate invaders and house entire communities of soldiers, servants, and whichever relatives refused to leave. Living in one wasn't like staying at a luxury inn. It was more like moving into a very large, very uncomfortable, high-security prison, where the warden thinks you're not bleeding enough. Unlike the magical version with singing chandeliers and spotless floors, the real castles had more in common with war zones and weather-beaten barns. Most of the interior was utilitarian at best. Think endless grey stone, open fireplaces belching smoke, and hallways that echoed like haunted cathedrals. And those lavish banquets. Sure, if you enjoy eating half-cooked venison next to someone loudly slurping pottage and throwing bones on the floor. Romanticizing castle life is like romanticizing camping during a thunderstorm, except the tent is on fire, the marshmallows are moldy, and someone just threw a javelin at you. For the upper crust, a castle was a symbol, a statement, something to make your enemies jealous and your peasants feel appropriately small. It was the medieval version of a luxury SUV with terrible gas mileage. Impressive, yes, but no one's claiming it's convenient. In fact, for all their towering walls and impressive drawbridges, castles were so uncomfortable that many nobles fled them the moment the war drums stopped beating. They preferred manor houses, which were like castles' less dramatic cousins, fewer murder holes, better gardens, and fewer chances of being woken up by a torch-wielding invader. Even royalty, when not parading their power, opted for residences with things like sunlight, privacy, and floors that didn't try to kill you when wet. Let's also not forget the human element. A castle was never empty. Servants were everywhere, constantly sweeping, cooking, stoking fires, or just trying to avoid being yelled at. The notion of solitude was as foreign as plumbing. Even in a private chamber, there was always someone, an attendant, a guard, or a jester popping in uninvited. If you wanted alone time, your best bet was getting lost in the woods and pretending to hunt wild boar. And then there were the villagers. Yes, those humble folks living in thatched roof homes down the hill. You know, the people fairy tales usually depict as muddy extras waiting to cheer for the prince. Ironically, they might have had it better. Their homes, while simple, were easier to heat. They lived closer to fresh food, and they didn't have to climb 50 spiral stairs just to find a toilet that emptied into the breeze. When winter rolled in, the villagers bundled up, cooked over warm fires, and crammed together in ways that, while smelly, kept them alive. Meanwhile, castle dwellers were shivering in stone towers, counting frostbite as character development. In the end, castles weren't built for comfort. They were built for survival. Siege resistance trumped lumbar support. Strategic views mattered more than where you'd put the sofa. The walls were thick enough to stop arrows, but not thick enough to silence your cousin's snoring or the castle dog's endless howling. And while we might swoon today over castle ruins in the mist, it's probably best we view them from a safe distance, preferably with a cup of tea, central heating, and no risk of dysentery. Fairy tales forgot to mention the damp floors, drafty halls, and the smell of boiled cabbage mixed with despair. It's the 19th century. You're in London. The fog is thick, the soot is thicker, and your accountant just divided by zero. Welcome to the early 1800s, a world teetering on the brink of modernity, but still firmly rooted in horse poop and handwritten ledgers. Steam engines are puffing, the British Empire is swelling, and somewhere a man in a waistcoat is trying to multiply 6-digit numbers using only a candle and prayer. This is the era of corsets, coal fires, and catastrophic math errors. Let's set the scene. London at the dawn of the Victorian age is a bubbling stew of invention and insanity. The city smells like wet leather, chimney smoke, and ambition. Trains are beginning to chug across the countryside. Telegraph wires are starting to hum with coded conversation. Factories belch smoke into the skyline like dragons that have figured out payroll. But behind all this progress, there's a problem. one no amount of mustache wax can disguise. The math? It's a mess. You see, in the early 1800s, there were no calculators, no computers, and no helpful apps reminding you what 7 times 8 is. Every mathematical calculation, from the interest rate on a loan to the trajectory of a cannonball, had to be done by hand, and not just by any hand, by a human being known as a computer. Yes, that was the actual job title. A computer was a person who sat at a desk and did math until they wept ink. These human computers were the unsung heroes of the Industrial Revolution, and also its biggest liability. Because no matter how dedicated you were, if your job involved long division by candlelight while wearing a cravat, mistakes were inevitable, and mistakes in this era could be catastrophic. Shipwrecks happened because someone dropped a decimal. Bridges collapsed because trigonometry said close enough. Bank accounts mysteriously emptied because a clerk misread his own handwriting and gave someone way too many zeros. Britain was becoming a technological juggernaut powered by some truly questionable subtraction. Enter Charles Babbage, a man who looked at this mountain of mathematical misery and said, in essence, there has to be a better way, preferably one that doesn't involve Brian from accounting. Born in 1791, Babbage came of age in this soup of smoky innovation and numerical chaos. From a young age, he wasn't just good at math, he loved it with the intensity of a man who would one day declare war on street musicians for distracting him from it. He saw numbers not as tools, but as elegant little truths, perfect, logical, and tragically vulnerable to the sausage-fingered errors of humanity. So when Babbage stared into the abyss of endless arithmetic mistakes, he didn't blink. He had a different idea, a wild one, a machine that could do the thinking, not just crunch numbers faster than any clerk, but do it perfectly every time, a mechanical brain powered by cranks and gears that would eliminate human error with the cold efficiency of steel. To most of his contemporaries this was madness, but to Babbage it was math therapy. He didn't want to replace people. Well, okay, maybe he did, but really what he wanted was a future where technology could assist thought, not just labor. The steam engine had replaced muscle. Why couldn't something replace the mental gymnastics of a man sweating through logarithms in a gaslit room? That was the seed, the origin story. Before he built engines or battled accordions, Charles Babbage was just a man sick of watching the world stumble through equations like a drunk on roller skates. And it wasn't just about fixing math. This was a time when the very idea of systems, scientific, social and industrial, was evolving. The British government, in its infinite wisdom, was starting to realize that running an empire required more than red uniforms and cannonballs. It required data, navigation tables, population statistics, financial forecasts, and all of those relied on, math. The only problem was, no one could do it reliably. Imagine trying to expand global trade routes while everyone's math homework is wrong. Babbage did, and it gave him a headache big enough to change the course of human history. So this chapter isn't just about smog and multiplication tables. It's about why the world needed a Charles Babbage, why a man with an obsession for precision, an intolerance for error, and a deep-seated loathing of organ music would one day become the father of the modern computer. Because before there were laptops, before there were code languages, before there were IT departments that asked if you tried turning it off and on again, there was Charles Babbage, a man who looked at the world's best math and politely screamed into the void. Coming up next, just how far he'd go to turn his idea into a machine, and how many engineers, investors, and confused Victorians he'd drag along with him. He was a child prodigy, but with the soul of a man yelling at you to get off his lawn in Latin. Charles Babbage came into the world on December 26, 1791, in London, a Christmas hangover for his parents and, eventually, for all of human computing. He was the son of a wealthy banker, which meant two things. 1, he had access to a proper education, and 2, he had the time and resources to spend an alarming amount of his life being very angry at things most people would simply walk around. But before he was the poster child for Victorian grumpiness, little Charles was a sickly child, prone to fevers and delicate health. He wasn't exactly the type to go charging around the garden with a toy musket. Instead, he spent most of his early years indoors, nose deep in books. Some kids built forts. Charles built an immunity to human interaction. He wasn't so much raised as he was forged in libraries. By age 8, he had read more about algebra than most adults cared to admit existed. While other boys were still learning how to throw stones at birds, Charles was already critiquing the philosophical flaws of Newtonian mechanics, and yes, he was insufferable about it. When he finally made his way to Cambridge in 1810, entering Trinity College, he expected to find his intellectual equals. What he found instead was a math curriculum that hadn't been updated since Isaac Newton had a functioning pulse. The mathematics at Cambridge was dusty, clunky, and somehow allergic to anything invented after the year 1700. Naturally, Babbage was horrified. In fact, one of his earliest academic rebellions was organizing the Analytical Society, a group of students who met in secret to promote modern continental mathematics, particularly the stuff coming out of France. You know, the enemy. In post-Napoleonic Britain, advocating for French math was only slightly less scandalous than declaring your support for indoor plumbing at a royal dinner. Their motto, "It is desirable to introduce a more perfect notation," which is basically 19th century math nerds speak for, "Everyone here is wrong but us." This society wasn't just about math, it was about revolution. Babbage and his tiny intellectual insurgents were furious that British mathematics still clung to outdated notation, ancient techniques, and a complete refusal to acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, the continent had a few useful ideas. Of course, revolutionaries tend to be a little intense, and Charles Babbage was no exception. He wasn't just brilliant, he was confrontational about it. He had the social warmth of a broken abacus. He didn't suffer fools gladly, or quietly, or even at all. He once described an academic rival's work as a useless heap of nonsense, and that was before lunch. He could derail an entire dinner party by asking why no one had calculated the angular momentum of the tableware. You know, that one person who corrects your grammar mid-sentence? Now imagine they also wrote you a 20-page treatise explaining your mistake, then published it in a newspaper. That was Babbage at 20. And while some people grow out of being intellectually unbearable, Charles Babbage leaned into it like it was a full-time career. He believed deeply, violently at times, that the world would be a better place if it were more precise, more logical, and significantly quieter. He also had a lifelong obsession with classifying things, everything. People, behaviors, problems, types of noise, which we'll get to much later. If it could be measured or broken into variables, he was interested. If it couldn't, it was probably a waste of time. This tendency began early. At age 12, he reportedly questioned the logical basis of religious dogma, not to rebel, but because it just didn't add up. As far as young Charles was concerned, if God had created the world, he really could have used a better blueprint for humanity's thought process, preferably one involving logarithmic tables and steam valves. While still in his teens, he had already begun forming the mental architecture that would later lead to his mechanical engines. He didn't just do math, he saw systems. To him, everything from a city's population to the number of apples in a barrel could and should be processed, organized, and rendered into perfect columns of numbers. But this was more than youthful arrogance. There was, deep down in Babbage's occasionally volcanic personality, a kind of moral fury about waste of time, of resources, of brain power. He wasn't just irritated by mistakes, he was offended by them, like they were personal betrayals of rational thought. So by the time he left Cambridge, he wasn't just a mathematical genius, he was a man on a mission to bring precision to a world full of chaos, one equation at a time. He had no idea he'd eventually invent the foundations of computing, but he did know that whatever came next, it would not involve tolerating sloppy math or sloppy anything for that matter. What Charles Babbage wanted was a world that ticked like clockwork. Unfortunately, he was living in a society that wheezed like a badly tuned accordion, which may explain why his tolerance for noise, inefficiency, and basically all other human beings steadily declined from this point on. Welcome to the early 19th century, where arithmetic wasn't just difficult, it was dangerous. Tables of logarithms and trigonometric values were used by engineers, architects, astronomers, and ship navigators to avoid things like collapsing bridges and sailing directly into cliffs. These tables were painstakingly calculated by hand, usually by a small army of human computers, which, to be clear, were not machines, but underpaid math nerds who occasionally got bored and multiplied 7 by 9 to get Tuesday. Enter Charles Babbage, a man who did not suffer fools, especially when those fools were responsible for math mistakes. In fact, one could argue that Babbage's entire adult life was a vendetta against error-prone math tables. After all, if you're going to calculate the trajectory of a cannonball, you want to make sure it doesn't land in the general's private garden. Babbage once described checking these tables as wading through a bog of errors, which sounds more like a bad hiking trip than a career in mathematics. So, what do you do when you're a mathematical genius with a burning hatred for numerical inaccuracy? If you're Charles Babbage, you roll up your sleeves, glare at a pile of log tables, and declare, "I shall replace every one of you with a brass behemoth that never takes coffee breaks." Thus was born the idea for the difference engine, a mechanical calculator that promised to do in minutes what took humans hours, and do it without ever asking for a raise or getting distracted by pigeons. Now, let's not underestimate how wild this idea was. The difference engine wasn't just a calculator, it was the calculator. A mechanical marvel with hundreds, even thousands of moving parts, all cranking away in harmony like a very sophisticated cuckoo clock with a math degree. It could add, subtract, and even print its results directly onto paper, a groundbreaking feature at a time when most printers were either monks or screaming. Imagine a dining table. Now imagine that table made of gears, cogs, and steam. Now imagine that it cost more than most small houses and occasionally caught fire. That's the difference engine. When Babbage first unveiled his plan to the scientific community, reactions ranged from polite applause to, "Are you feeling quite all right, Charles?" But then something extraordinary happened. The British government said, "Sure, we'll fund this." This was the 1820s equivalent of getting a tech grant from Silicon Valley. Babbage was given £1,500 to begin construction, a princely sum that could buy you a country house or approximately 1/10 of a difference engine. To build it, Babbage teamed up with Joseph Clement, a skilled engineer who specialized in precision tools. It was a good match, until they realized the machine required tolerances of 1/1000th of an inch, and Clement was working in an era where the most precise tool was basically a really sharp chisel. The project progressed slowly, as Babbage continually made improvements and alterations, occasionally saying things like, "Wait, let's make it more complicated," which is the inventor's version of "hold my beer." The government, unsurprisingly, began to get antsy. What they'd hoped would be a neat, practical device turned into a sprawling brass jungle gym that consumed money like a Victorian black hole. After years of starts, stops, and endless modifications, the project stalled completely. Clement quit, funding dried up, and the difference engine became the most expensive paperweight in London. But here's the thing, it worked. At least the portion that was built did. Small-scale models showed that Babbage's design was sound, revolutionary even. He had, in essence, invented mechanical computing, a century before it would become practical. The real problem wasn't the math. It was the 19th century technology desperately trying to catch up to Babbage's 22nd century brain. Let's pause to appreciate what Babbage had actually done. He envisioned a machine that could not only calculate numbers, but also automate the creation of error-free tables, replacing an entire human workforce with gears and ingenuity. It was the ultimate do-it-yourself or build a robot to do it move. He wasn't just inventing a machine, he was inventing a future, and yet, despite this monumental leap in thinking, Babbage's biggest obstacle wasn't mathematics or engineering, it was bureaucracy. The government, ever wary of spending more on something it didn't understand, pulled the plug. Babbage was left with fragments of a dream, a head full of ideas, and the knowledge that he'd been absolutely right but 50 years too early. In modern terms, it's like inventing the smartphone in 1910 and being told, "That's very clever, but we've just invested heavily in telegrams." Still, Babbage didn't give up. He moved on to bigger ideas, which we'll cover in the next chapter, but it's worth pausing here to admire the sheer audacity of the difference engine. It wasn't just a machine, it was a declaration of war on human error, a steam-powered "I told you so," and in a world where most people were still figuring out how to light a room without setting their drapes on fire, Charles Babbage dared to imagine a future where even numbers had no room for mistakes. Which is kind of funny when you realize he never actually finished it. But hey, points for effort. Building a Victorian-era computer was a bit like trying to knit a sweater with spaghetti. Technically possible, but mostly just heartbreaking. Charles Babbage, our moody genius from the last chapter, had already won over the people with his ambitious plans for the difference engine, a device that promised to end the reign of sloppy human arithmetic. But now came the part that even he hadn't fully calculated, actually building the thing. Let's start with the materials. Today's computers are made of silicon, plastic, and wizardry. Babbage's prototype, brass, iron, and industrial optimism. Every part had to be machined by hand, with tolerances tighter than the waistbands of Victorian corsets. This meant hiring precision engineers, of which there were about 3 in the entire country, and praying they didn't sneeze while chiseling a cogwheel. The main engineer on the job was Joseph Clement, a gifted machinist with a love for fine tools and an allergy to efficiency. Clement agreed to build the engine, but only if he could also build a new workshop first. Naturally, Babbage said yes, because what's a few extra £1,000 when you're trying to create the future? Unfortunately, Clement's idea of workshop turned out to be less shed and more palace of gears. He demanded top-tier equipment, endless custom tools, and heated floors. For math. By the mid-1830s, the difference engine was becoming a difference ordeal. Babbage's budget exploded faster than a boiler under pressure. Parliament began to grumble, the Treasury. Never a fan of giving money to projects with a 0% completion rate, demanded updates. Babbage, rather than simplifying his design or hiring a PR agent, decided the best move was to make the machine more complicated. Yes, really. Babbage's genius had a fatal flaw. He couldn't stop improving things. Midway through building version 1.0, he began sketching out a newer, even better machine, eventually to be called the analytical engine. This didn't go over well. Imagine backing a Kickstarter for a toaster and getting an email saying, "Actually, we've invented a jet engine instead. Please send more money." That was essentially the British government's experience. Meanwhile, technical problems multiplied like Victorian rabbits. The difference engine needed over 25,000 parts, most of which had never existed before. Screws had to be custom-made. Gears had to be cut with agonizing precision. Even transporting the parts required heavy lifting equipment and a calm belief in miracles. Babbage started referring to the project as sublime and monumental, which is Victorian for "oh no, what have I done?" Clement, growing increasingly frustrated, wanted more money. Babbage, growing increasingly frustrated, wanted more money. The two men clashed like titans, except instead of epic sword fights, it was a series of very stern letters and passive-aggressive notes about machining tolerances. Eventually, Clement walked off the job in a flurry of unpaid invoices and unfulfilled gear dreams. The difference engine, unfinished and unloved, was left to gather dust in a workshop that had cost more than a small naval ship. The government, now thoroughly fed up, officially pulled funding in 1842 after investing £17,000, a massive sum at the time. For comparison, that's roughly equivalent to several £1,000,000 today, or one London flat's worth of disappointment. Babbage was devastated. He had gotten so close, the prototype had worked in pieces. He'd even displayed them at parties where guests politely clapped while secretly wondering if he was mad. But the full machine never saw the light of day. All that was left were piles of brass, angry letters, and a man who'd just tried to build a computer using 19th century tools and 18th century patience. In hindsight, it wasn't that Babbage failed, it's that he succeeded at dreaming in a world that hadn't caught up. The technology of the time couldn't quite meet the demands of his vision. Steam and steel were powerful, but they couldn't run the kind of code Babbage wanted to write, code that wouldn't exist for another 100 years. He was, as one historian put it, a man who'd invented the future with tools from the past. Still, Babbage didn't give up. He simply pivoted. From now on, his sights would be set even higher, even bolder, and even more unbuildable. But before we follow him there, let's take a quick detour, because while his dreams of mechanical glory may have stalled, his opinions didn't. And Charles Babbage had many, many opinions, especially about how much he hated street musicians. It's the 1830s, and Charles Babbage, our cranky Victorian techno-wizard, has already sunk years of his life and buckets of the government's cash into building the difference engine, a mechanical calculator designed to fix bad math with big gears. But as he's tinkering with his error-reducing contraption, a new idea takes hold. Why stop at a calculator? Why not build a machine that could actually think? That's right. Before anyone had typed a word into a keyboard, clicked a mouse, or even plugged anything into a socket, Babbage was dreaming of the world's first programmable computer. It would be called the analytical engine, and it was so far ahead of its time, most people responded to it with polite nods and panicked confusion. What if my calculator had opinions? The difference engine could crunch numbers, but it was limited. It could only solve specific types of equations. It was like building a really smart abacus. Impressive, yes, but not exactly dynamic. Babbage, who had grown frustrated with mechanical constraints, envisioned something wildly ambitious, a machine that could handle any computation, not just the ones it was hardwired to do. In other words, he wasn't just building a better calculator, he was building a Victorian-era laptop. Enter the analytical engine, a steam-powered monster with memory, control flow, and the ability to follow instructions. Babbage designed it with components that mirrored what we now recognize as modern computing essentials: a store, memory to hold numbers, a mill, CPU, to perform arithmetic and logic, a control unit, with the ability to make decisions using conditional logic, for example, if this, then that, and input-output via punched cards. Yes, the same kind used in 19th century weaving looms. Because why not borrow from fashion to build the future? Imagine describing this to a 19th century audience. You'd basically be saying, I want to build a mechanical brain that can decide things. Also, it'll be fueled by steam and red hole-punched cardboard. And that's when half the room nervously checks for the nearest exit. Luckily for Babbage, not everyone was confused. One person got it, and that person was Ada Lovelace, daughter of the poet Lord Byron and an absolute force of intellectual nature. Where most people saw a metal beast spewing numbers, Ada saw a machine that could someday compose music, generate art, and maybe even write terrible poetry about itself. She had imagination, vision, and more importantly, she understood the math. In 1843, she translated an Italian mathematician's paper on the analytical engine and added extensive footnotes 3 times longer than the actual paper. These notes weren't just margin scribbles. In them, Ada outlined how the machine could be programmed using algorithms, effectively creating the world's first computer program. And this is Victorian England, mind you. Most people thought trains were suspiciously fast, and here was Ada, casually describing how to tell a machine what to do using symbolic instructions. She didn't just peek into the future, she wrote it in longhand. You might be wondering, okay, this all sounds amazing, so where's the analytical engine? And the answer, in true Babbage fashion, is complicated. For starters, it was absurdly complex. It would have required tens of thousands of parts, each machined with precision no workshop of the time could consistently produce. Victorian metalworkers could make guns and clocks, sure, but building a machine the size of a locomotive with the precision of a Swiss watch, that's a tall order. Also, Babbage's charming personality, read his unmatched ability to annoy everyone, his perfectionism led to endless redesigns. He constantly changed plans, made no practical prototypes, and confused his funders. The British government, once eager to support the next big leap in science, eventually threw up its hands and redirected the money toward projects with fewer gears and less yelling. Even though it was never built, the analytical engine wasn't a failure, quite the opposite. It was a blueprint for the modern world. Its concepts directly influenced future computing pioneers like Alan Turing, who referred to Babbage's machine when laying the foundations for computer science in the 20th century. The engine also shattered the ceiling of what machines could be. Before Babbage, mechanical devices were tools, useful, precise, and dumb. After Babbage, the idea of a programmable machine took root. The world would never look at cogs and wheels the same way again, and Ada Lovelace, she became a posthumous hero of STEM, a symbol of what happens when you mix math with imagination. Today, there's an entire programming language named after her. The analytical engine was never completed. It remained a stack of drawings, unbuilt dreams, and unanswered questions. But make no mistake, it was the birth of the idea that machines could do more than follow, they could think, solve, and create. And as you scroll through your phone, doom scrolling through social media, or asking your smart speaker to play whale noises, spare a moment for Charles Babbage, the man who invented the concept of a computer, then lost sleep over someone playing a hurdy-gurdy outside his window. Because sometimes the future is built by grumpy geniuses with messy desks and even messier dreams. Imagine inventing the future and watching it quietly gather dust while everyone applauds the past. That's the Charles Babbage experience in a nutshell. After years of designing, diagramming, and desperately trying to bring mechanical computing to life, Babbage found himself at the receiving end of a classic 19th century disappearing act. The British government stopped returning his calls. Not literally, of course, since calls hadn't been invented yet, but if there had been phones, it would have gone straight to Victorian voicemail. The sound of a sigh, a quill scratching, and then silence. The trouble began, unsurprisingly, with money. Or more accurately, with the government's mounting suspicion that Charles Babbage was spending a lot of it without producing anything remotely resembling a functioning machine. To be fair, they weren't entirely wrong. Years had gone by since Babbage proposed the difference engine, and despite fascinating lectures, endless drafts, and a growing mountain of technical documents, what they had in return was a pile of brass parts, some spectacular drawings, and Babbage explaining again how it would all come together eventually, just as soon as he found the right gear. Complicating matters further was Babbage's relationship with the very institution writing his checks. He had what could generously be described as an abrasive personality. Less generously, the man had the social skills of a tax audit. He was brilliant, no doubt, but also relentlessly critical of others, especially those who controlled the purse strings. If a bureaucrat questioned his timeline or budget, Babbage responded with disdain, mathematical jargon, and the Victorian equivalent of a rage tweet, which was usually a very long, scathing letter printed in the newspaper. By the mid-1840s, after nearly 2 decades of this pattern, the government had had enough. The funding stopped. The difference engine was shelved. The analytical engine, still in its conceptual phase, never made it to the brass and steam prototype stage. And Babbage, once the darling of scientific promise, found himself increasingly isolated, respected in name but dismissed in practice. The sting of abandonment didn't wear off. Babbage continued to write, to refine, and to lecture, but something shifted. His writings became more defensive, his tone more bitter. In his later works, he occasionally referred to his machines, not with pride, but as symbols of how deeply misunderstood he had been by a world too dull to see brilliance when it sat in front of them, whirring faintly and leaking steam. To be clear, Babbage didn't exactly slink off into obscurity with his tail between his equations. He remained a public intellectual, kept active in mathematical societies, and still believed in the potential of his work. But the grand vision, the mechanical future that would one day reshape humanity's relationship with numbers, information, and thought itself, that faded into the background noise of Victorian ambition shelved between unbuilt bridges and airships powered by hot tea. What's particularly tragic is how close he came. The analytical engine, as conceived, would have had almost all the core elements of a modern computer. a mill to process data, CPU, a store to hold memory, RAM, punch cards for input, software, and the ability to make decisions based on conditions, logic, all this in the 1830s. It's like discovering someone in ancient Rome had invented a microwave, but couldn't get the Senate to fund it because they still preferred their bread baked on rocks. And so Babbage's story ends, at least for the 19th century, not with a triumphant unveiling, but with quiet obscurity. His plans gathered dust. His name appeared less frequently in the scientific journals. When he died in 1871, he was remembered more as a cranky eccentric than as a visionary, a man who hated noise, loved numbers, and built machines that no one fully understood or took seriously enough to finish. That might have been the end of it, but history, like software, has a way of revising itself. In the 20th century, as computers began to evolve from room-sized calculators into world-dominating tools, a few curious minds began digging through old archives. What they found wasn't just dusty math, it was prophecy. Babbage's designs, in hindsight, were astonishingly close to how real computers would work 100 years later. Scholars and scientists alike re-evaluated his legacy. The man once dismissed as a failed tinkerer was suddenly cast as the grandfather of computing, finally getting the respect he'd long demanded, though tragically too late to hear it himself. And so Babbage re-entered the history books, not as the man who failed to build the future, but as the one who dared to design it before the world was ready. For most Victorian-era scientists, the great adversary was ignorance, or maybe the occasional combustion experiment gone slightly too boom. But for Charles Babbage, his nemesis was far more insidious. Accordion-wielding, monkey-accompanied, coin-collecting public enemy number one, the organ grinder. Yes, the man who imagined machines that could change the course of civilization also spent a shocking amount of his life waging a one-man war on the London street music scene. And not just with letters of complaint or some passive-aggressive sighs. No, Babbage declared total, relentless, and frequently shovel-assisted war on the sounds of the Victorian street. Let's set the scene. It's the 1850s. London is loud, crowded, and in the middle of its industrial boom. Horse-drawn carts rumble past, factory whistles screech, and children appear to scream recreationally. But nothing, absolutely nothing, grated Babbage's soul like the repetitive wheeze of a barrel organ being cranked under his window by a man who may or may not be wearing a vest made of old soup stains. Now, to be fair, Victorian street music was a lot. Barrel organs, those mechanical, portable, semi-automated instruments, were everywhere. You couldn't toss a crusty meat pie without hitting an organ grinder or their occasionally dancing monkey. These street performers operated in the name of entertainment. But to Babbage it sounded like Satan's xylophone was doing laps around his study. And if there was one thing Babbage required in life, it was silence. His entire personality was built around thinking deeply, scowling frequently, and expecting everyone else to stop existing while he did so. When noise invaded that sanctum, it wasn't just a disturbance, it was an affront to logic itself. So he documented it, like any grumpy genius would. Babbage kept meticulous noise journals, literal logs where he wrote down dates, times, and descriptions of every acoustic offense against his dignity. Street musician appeared at 2:35 p.m., played Pop Goes the Weasel poorly, attempted communication in broken English, result rage 4 out of 5. He didn't stop there. Babbage, ever the man of calculation, even tried to estimate the number of hours of his life that had been stolen by these sonic saboteurs. He claimed that he lost 1/4 of his productive life due to London's noise pollution. One wonders how long it took him to calculate that figure over the wailing of a nearby hurdy-gurdy. But wait, it gets better. Babbage didn't just complain, he lobbied. He wrote impassioned essays against street music with titles like Observations of Street Nuisances, which honestly sounds like the most Victorian thing ever published. In these texts, he advocated for public policy that would ban street musicians entirely from residential neighborhoods. The man's dream was a London where not even a triangle could be dinged without a license. Unsurprisingly, the organ grinders did not take kindly to this crusade. In fact, Many began deliberately playing outside his house because they knew it enraged him. Picture it, a bunch of petty musicians forming a kind of passive-aggressive drum circle outside the home of one of the greatest minds of the age, just to watch his eyebrows twitch with fury. The clashes escalated. Babbage started calling the police almost daily. He filed over 250 complaints in just 1 year. At one point, the local beat cop probably just nodded and asked, "Same accordion again, sir?" But perhaps the most iconic moment in this noise-fueled saga was when Babbage physically chased a street performer down the street with a shovel. That's not metaphorical. That's mad scientist turned cartoon villain energy. Newspapers caught wind of his vendetta and had a field day. Babbage, once respected for his visionary machines, became something of a punchline. Cartoons portrayed him shaking his fist at fiddlers. Rumors spread that he'd gone entirely bonkers. In the press and among the people, he became known less as the father of computing and more as that crank who hates tubers. Of course, behind the comedy is a bit of tragedy. Babbage wasn't just irritated, he felt besieged. The same man who had devoted his life to reason, logic, and invention felt surrounded by what he saw as irrational chaos. His machines remained unbuilt. His dreams of technological revolution languished in dusty sketches and half-made gears. And outside his window, the music never stopped. It's one of history's most poetic ironies. A man trying to shape the future, yet unable to get a moment's peace in his present. And yet, even in this absurd feud, Babbage's intensity never wavered. He applied the same energy to silencing barrel organs as he did to building programmable machines. Say what you will, but he was consistent. In the end, Charles Babbage may have failed to rid the world of noisy street music, but his obsession did immortalize him in a way he probably didn't intend. After all, history is full of inventors, but only one of them wrote a 30-page essay on why flutes should be illegal in cities. Charles Babbage was a man powered by mathematical rigor, visionary imagination, and most prominently in his later years, boiling, white-hot irritation. While most Victorian gentlemen were content to grumble into their tea about the state of the world, Babbage took it one step further. No, scratch that. He took it several hundred steps further, usually while pacing furiously around his house, calculating the decibel level of a street vendor's bell, and writing scathing essays to newspapers like it was a full-time job. If the 19th century had a Yelp page, Babbage would have filled it single-handedly, with bonus footnotes and appendices. By the time he entered his 50s, Babbage had gone full old man yells at cloud, except the clouds were London's entire population. His war on organ grinders is legendary and thoroughly covered in the previous chapter, but it was merely the overture to a symphony of societal frustration. Noise in all its unpredictable, maddening forms became his arch-enemy, but instead of plugging his ears and moving on with his life like the rest of us, Babbage took the scientific route. He started measuring it. Yes, measuring it. Like a Victorian Batman with a barometer, Babbage meticulously logged the interruptions that disrupted his work, an effort that combined data collection with pure exasperation. He once calculated, with what we can assume was entirely unnecessary precision, that he lost 1/4 of his productive life to interruptions from the outside world. This included street musicians, noisy children, people ringing his doorbell, the clatter of carts, social calls he didn't want, and perhaps the sound of the earth spinning slightly too loudly on its axis. But Babbage didn't just suffer in silence, he wrote about it loudly. In 1864, he published Passages from the Life of a Philosopher, and within its pages he gave himself the liberty of several deeply cathartic rants. Entire sections of the book read less like a memoir and more like a Victorian burn book. He detailed the hours he spent fighting noise pollution and listed every type of nuisance that haunted his day. One of his most famous calculations estimated the annual damage done by London's street nuisances, breaking it down by type and frequency. Spoiler alert, it wasn't optimistic. He even took to writing open letters in newspapers, warning the public about the unchecked growth of urban incivility. He lambasted chimney sweeps, bakers, fruit sellers, and children, especially children. In one particularly irate passage, he questioned the moral fiber of mothers who allowed their little ones to play screeching games in public. This was not a man interested in compromise. This was a man who had a list of grievances longer than a Dickens novel and was determined to file every single one with the court of public opinion. What makes this all the more amusing if you weren't one of his neighbors is that Babbage framed all his complaints in the cold language of logic and numbers. To him, noise wasn't just annoying, it was inefficient, a threat to progress, a chaotic disruption to the mathematical elegance of his universe. He didn't simply find a child's laughter irritating, he saw it as a quantifiable attack on productivity. His mind ran on algorithms, and the world kept throwing sand in the gears. Unsurprisingly, the public grew weary of his tirades, while he was never openly mocked to his face. Victorian manners, after all. Satirical publications had a field day. One cartoon depicted him peering furiously through his curtains with a telescope, recording the precise pitch of a hurdy-gurdy. Another poked fun at his obsession with silence by showing him placing a cork in a baby's mouth with scientific instruments. Though history would eventually remember him as a pioneer of computing, many of his contemporaries remembered him as that eccentric gentleman who declared war on birthday parties. But Babbage wasn't just shouting into the void. He genuinely believed he was championing a cause. In his mind, cities could only become more civilized, more advanced, if they were more orderly and quieter. He viewed public disruptions as signs of decay in a society that should have been marching toward mechanical precision and intellectual refinement. The same mind that imagined programmable engines was also dreaming of a better, tidier world, one where people respected logic, timetables, and ideally, didn't blast folk music outside his window at 6 in the morning. By the end of his life, Charles Babbage had not only designed machines that could have revolutionized computing, but also penned more essays about annoying neighbors than most suburban Facebook groups. He was an innovator, a logician, a dreamer, and yes, a professional grump. If nothing else, he should be remembered as the only man in history who tried to statistically prove that children were too loud. When Charles Babbage died in 1871, he probably hoped someone would finish the mechanical marvels he spent his life designing. What he likely didn't expect was that he'd be remembered not just as the father of computing, but also as the father of Victorian noise complaints. While the difference engine and the analytical engine never fully materialized in his lifetime, their blueprints, scribbled notes, and obsessively detailed diagrams quietly simmered in the background of history, waiting for someone to dust them off. That someone would arrive nearly a century later, during an era when computing finally had the tools, electricity, vacuum tubes, and fewer crank handles to become a reality. But to truly understand Babbage's legacy, you have to look at both sides of him. The groundbreaking innovator who imagined programmable machines before light bulbs existed, and the Victorian grump who once wrote letters to the newspaper estimating how much of his life was stolen by noisy street musicians. Spoiler, it was a lot. Let's start with the genius part. Babbage's analytical engine was so advanced for its time that many people didn't fully grasp what he was trying to build. Not even he may have entirely understood the implications. Loops, memory storage, conditional operations, these weren't just the features of a calculator. They were the skeleton of modern computing. Ada Lovelace saw it. She even envisioned using it for music and graphics applications that wouldn't arrive until about 150 years later, when computers finally stopped looking like radiators and started fitting on desks. Fast forward to the 20th century. Alan Turing, one of the key architects of modern computing, drew direct inspiration from Babbage's work. Historians and computer scientists revisited those dusty old blueprints and realized, oh, he really was onto something. Babbage's analytical engine became a kind of retroactive prototype for modern computers, and his name finally entered the canon of scientific heroes, right between Newton's apples and Einstein's hair. But Babbage's reputation comes with a side of curmudgeon. He left behind a legacy of scientific ambition tangled in bureaucratic failure, bad funding, and constant friction with the public, usually over something loud. His rants, journals, and published tirades remain a masterclass in passive-aggressive brilliance. He even calculated the exact number of obnoxious interruptions in a year, as if he were trying to code a Victorian-era noise-cancelling algorithm using nothing but pure disdain. Ironically, Babbage's dream was for a world that could run on order, logic, and silence. He imagined machines that would eliminate human error, simplify calculation, and reduce the chaos of Victorian life into something you could control with a crank and a gear. But his actual life? It was messy, noisy, and frustrating. The very city he lived in, London, never stopped clanging, shrieking, and wheezing long enough for him to concentrate. And yet, that's where his story ends up becoming strangely poetic. He invented the blueprint for modern computing, and history returned the favor by building it quietly in the background long after his death. Today, his machines, or parts of them, sit in museums. His face appears on plaques, his name in textbooks. He's recognized not just as a brilliant mind, but as someone whose stubbornness helped push the boundaries of what was possible, even if his tolerance for flute players was non-existent. So, in the end, Babbage got what he wanted. His name lives on in server rooms and algorithms. His machines were built posthumously, finally fulfilling his vision, minus the shouting at buskers. And the world now hums, not with organ grinders, but with the soft, electric buzz of machines he could only dream of. Machines that, in some twisted way, might have helped block out the noise. In the age of roaring flappers, speakeasies, and the golden dawn of jazz, one brilliant mind was out in a field, dragging a plough behind a horse, and dreaming of electronic image transmission. Yes, while other 14-year-olds were discovering the hormonal cocktail of puberty, Philo Farnsworth was quite literally inventing the future. Let's set the stage. It's the early 1920s in rural Utah, a place where life moved about as fast as molasses in a snowstorm. Electricity was still a luxury in many homes. Radios were cutting-edge tech, and most entertainment involved a fiddle, a porch, and someone named Ma hollering for supper. Amid this tranquil potato-dusted monotony was a boy named Philo, a name that sounds like a wizard's apprentice but belonged to a real kid with an unshakable love for science. Born in 1906, Philo Farnsworth grew up in a modest log cabin in Beaver, Utah, before his family relocated to a farm near Rigby, Idaho. This wasn't exactly Silicon Valley, unless of course you count the silicon in the soil. But even on this remote patch of earth, young Philo was light years ahead of his surroundings. From an early age, Farnsworth displayed the kind of curiosity that made parents nervous and teachers exhausted. He devoured magazines like Popular Science and Scientific American, often reading by kerosene lamp. He was the kind of kid who would take apart a washing machine just to understand why it spun, and then reassemble it better. While his classmates were busy flunking long division, Farnsworth was independently studying electricity, magnetism, and even Albert Einstein's theory of relativity. And mind you, this was before most schools were even teaching quantum anything. But his eureka moment, the birth of television, didn't happen in a lab or a classroom. It happened in a field. One day, while ploughing rows across a potato farm with almost obsessive precision, Farnsworth noticed something fascinating. The way the plough created parallel lines in the soil, one after another in a steady sequence. Now, most kids in that situation would have been thinking, this sucks, but not Philo. He looked at those rows and had a vision, not of mashed potatoes but of scanning electron beams. What if, he thought, an image could be broken into lines the same way the soil was ploughed? What if those lines could then be turned into electrical signals and transmitted, then reassembled line by line into a coherent picture? This wasn't just a passing thought. It was the foundational idea behind electronic television. While others were still fiddling with mechanical spinning discs and whirring contraptions that looked like rejected steampunk fan art, Philo's mind had leapt forward into a fully electronic system. No gears, no mirrors, just electrons, cathode ray tubes, and some good old-fashioned genius. And remember, he was 14. To put that in perspective, today's 14-year-olds are arguing on social media about whether pineapple belongs on pizza. Meanwhile, Farnsworth was conceptualizing a machine that would change global communication, entertainment, politics, and your ability to binge-watch cat videos 90 years later. His family, to their eternal credit, didn't dismiss his ideas as teenage nonsense. When Farnsworth showed his diagrams and theories to his high school science teacher, Justin Tolman, the man didn't laugh. Instead, he preserved one of the sketches on a blackboard, no less, recognizing even then that Philo was onto something revolutionary. And let's not gloss over this, Farnsworth wasn't just parroting information, he was inventing concepts that hadn't been developed yet. He figured out electron scanning tubes before he even owned a decent pair of shoes. He didn't have a university lab, a mentor, or financial backing. He had dirt, a plow, and a mind that wouldn't quit. In many ways, this moment, this field-born idea was the big bang of television. No cameras, no studios, no sitcoms with laugh tracks, just a teenage farm boy staring at soil and seeing signal processing. It's arguably one of the most poetic origin stories in technology. Man meets machine by way of manual labor, and here's the kicker. Farnsworth wasn't even trying to invent television per se. He just wanted to find a better way to transmit images using electrons. The fact that he ended up creating the backbone of modern visual media was to him a logical conclusion, not a moonshot. So while people were still shooting silent films and still toying with clunky machines that required spinning metal discs, Philo Farnsworth already had the blueprint for something better. He wasn't inspired by the glitz of the movie business or the roar of New York innovation. He was inspired by straight lines in a field and the desire to make the invisible visible. Funny how progress sometimes begins with a plow and a dream. While most teenagers were navigating the dangerous waters of high school dances and acne medication, Philo T. Farnsworth was busy revolutionizing the way humanity would experience moving pictures forever. After that legendary plow row epiphany in rural Utah, Philo's story didn't exactly jump cut to fortune and fame. It slow faded into Idaho, where a young genius with a taste for science and a complete disregard for teenage social norms decided to double down on his vision. Literally, Philo and his family moved to Rigby, Idaho, where they lived in a home powered by a windmill. Yes, a windmill, because when you're raising a future inventor of television, electricity via public utility just won't do. This minor inconvenience did nothing to deter Philo, who spent more time inside scribbling schematics than outside milking cows. He was a voracious reader, especially of popular science and scientific journals. One could say he inhaled more pages than fresh air. The topic he latched onto most fervently, electricity and how it could be used to do cool things like light bulbs and, more importantly, transmit moving images. Enter Justin Tolman, the high school chemistry teacher, who expected nothing more than the occasional overdue homework and maybe a few broken beakers. Instead, he got Philo Farnsworth. Tolman quickly recognized that this wasn't your average farm kid. When most students turned in messy essays about why the sky is blue, Philo handed over elaborate diagrams of electronic transmission systems. Not exactly textbook material, but fascinating nonetheless. Tolman became Farnsworth's earliest and most critical supporter. He loaned Philo books on electricity, wave theory, and vacuum tubes, the building blocks of future television tech. Most importantly, he listened. When Farnsworth began explaining his theoretical design for an all-electronic television system, free of clunky mechanical spinning discs or mirrors, Tolman didn't laugh or redirect him back to simpler topics like how batteries work. Instead, he encouraged him to keep going. One day, Philo sketched a rudimentary version of his idea on the blackboard, describing a system that could scan, transmit, and reassemble images using an electron beam in a vacuum tube. Tolman saved the sketch. That single act of supportive hoarding would later help prove in court that the invention of television didn't come from a massive corporation, but from a high school kid with a chalkboard. By the time Philo was in his late teens, he was already building prototypes in his spare time. He wasn't funded by Silicon Valley venture capitalists. He had no access to university labs. His tools included salvaged auto parts, burned-out vacuum tubes, and enough soldering smoke to make any fire marshal weep. But he had one thing in endless supply: obsession. In his early 20s, Philo moved to California and began working with two investors who actually believed his bizarre-sounding promise of moving pictures from thin air. He and his small team set up shop in a rented building and started piecing together the dream, one coil and cathode ray at a time. Most of the tech world still clung to the idea that mechanical television systems with spinning discs and flashing lights was the way forward. Farnsworth disagreed, mostly because he was right. At the heart of his innovation was the image dissector, a device that broke images into lines and converted them into electronic signals. This was the plow row vision made manifest. Farnsworth wasn't just sketching anymore. He was soldering and scanning and risking electrocution on a near-daily basis. And when he wasn't working in the lab, he was preparing paperwork, because by 1927, at the age of just 21, he was ready to file patents. Now, filing a patent isn't quite as exciting as, say, inventing television, but it's crucial. It's the legal equivalent of yelling shotgun in the race to claim who did something first. Farnsworth's first patent application covered his all-electronic television system, and he filed it with the confidence of someone who'd just engineered the future because he had. At the time, few people understood just how far-reaching this patent would be. Even fewer could spell cathode ray tube correctly on the first try. The moment Farnsworth applied for that patent, he officially stepped into the ring with Goliaths, most notably RCA, led by broadcasting baron David Sarnoff. But that fight would come later. For now, Philo had done the unthinkable, turned an idea dreamed up in a field of potatoes into something tangible, patentable, and soon revolutionary. So, while most of his peers were still figuring out how not to stall their dad's car on a hill, Philo Farnsworth had launched a career, filed groundbreaking patents, and forever altered the trajectory of human communication. Not bad for a kid from Idaho with a homemade lab and a teacher who believed in hoarding chalk drawings. Philo T. Farnsworth was no match for RCA, at least not on paper. He didn't have a corporate army, a legal dream team, or even a reliable paycheck most months. But what he did have was a head full of ideas, a few patents with his name on them, and just enough stubbornness to make history uncomfortable. And in 1930s America, when corporations were rapidly consolidating power faster than you could say capitalism, Farnsworth found himself smack in the middle of a technological turf war that would determine who owned the future of television. Enter David Sarnoff, the undisputed media emperor of the early 20th century. Sarnoff didn't just want to be a player in the television industry. He wanted to own it, regulate it, and sell it back to you at a profit. As head of the Radio Corporation of America, RCA, Sarnoff had already turned radio into an empire and wasn't about to let a potato farming prodigy stand between him and the glowing screens of tomorrow. Now, to Sarnoff, Farnsworth was an unfortunate speed bump on the highway to monopoly, but Farnsworth's invention wasn't theoretical anymore. He had already demonstrated a working prototype of an all-electronic television system. No spinning discs, no mechanical parts, just pure electronic transmission using his cathode ray innovations. RCA, however, was late to the game. Their scientists, including a man named Vladimir Zworykin, had been working on similar ideas after Farnsworth had already filed his patents. So what's a tech giant to do when someone else has the patent? Easy. You declare you invented it first, throw lawyers at the problem, and try to bury the little guy under enough paperwork to reforest the Amazon. In what can only be described as suspicious timing, Zworykin suddenly unveiled an independently developed television system that bore more than a passing resemblance to Farnsworth's patented technology. RCA's position was clear. They were too big to be beaten by someone with a garage, a dream, and a few chalk drawings. Farnsworth, meanwhile, wasn't exactly the trench warfare type. He was introverted, bookish, and happiest when surrounded by tubes, wires, and glowing cathode rays. But now he was being pulled into a full-blown legal showdown with one of the most powerful companies in America, a company that could afford to lose lawsuits as long as it won the war of attrition. The legal battle began to take shape like a high-stakes boxing match. with Farnsworth cast as the scrawny underdog from the farm, and Sarnoff as the industrial heavyweight in a tailored suit. RCA argued that Farnsworth's patents were vague, unoriginal, or flat-out invalid. Farnsworth's team, however, had an ace up their sleeve: dated sketches. Remember Justin Tolman, the high school teacher from Chapter 2? Turns out he had saved Farnsworth's original high school diagrams, the ones that laid out the television system before RCA's so-called independent invention. In court, Tolman's testimony was gold-plated credibility, like an old science fair project coming back with a lawyer and a vengeance. RCA's lawyers squirmed, Sarnoff fumed, and Farnsworth, he just quietly kept building his television in between depositions. Because genius doesn't stop just because someone's suing you. In 1935, after years of legal wrangling, the court ruled in favor of Farnsworth. RCA was forced to admit that Philo Farnsworth had in fact invented the core technology for electronic television. They eventually paid him licensing fees, but not without dragging their feet and crossing their arms like a kid being told to share his toys. It was a victory, yes, but it came with a caveat. Farnsworth may have won the legal battle, but RCA still controlled the airwaves, the money, and most importantly, the narrative. Sarnoff never forgot the defeat. Publicly, he would speak of television as RCA's triumph, rarely if ever acknowledging the young inventor from Utah. He didn't need to. RCA had the marketing power and broadcasting clout to write history in real time. As for Farnsworth, the victory was bittersweet. He had protected his invention, yes, but he now realized that invention alone wasn't enough. You also had to be ruthless, connected, and preferably wearing a three-piece suit made of ambition. And so Farnsworth went back to his lab, exhausted but still driven. Meanwhile, Sarnoff moved on with RCA's plans to mass-produce televisions, slap their logo on the front, and claim the future as their own. It was like someone stealing your recipe, adding ketchup, and winning a Michelin star for it. The courtroom battle was only the beginning. The war for recognition, for royalties, and for a rightful place in history would go on. But for now, Farnsworth had proven that brilliance could come from anywhere, even a farm, and that sometimes David does win. Just don't expect him to sell the rights to his story. The year was 1935, and Philo Farnsworth wasn't ploughing potato fields anymore. He was now knee-deep in a very different type of dirt: legal filings, patent infringement claims, and courtroom cross-examinations thick enough to clog a cathode ray tube. His opponent? The media Goliath known as RCA, an empire with deep pockets, deep grudges, and deeper denial that a teenage farm boy might have beaten them to the punch. Let's rewind. Farnsworth had already filed his patent for the all-electronic television system in 1927, but as his invention gained steam, so did the interest of RCA, specifically its CEO David Sarnoff, who had made it his life's mission to ensure RCA owned every frequency, filament, and flickering light beam in American living rooms. Farnsworth's invention was a major speed bump on Sarnoff's golden highway to monopoly, and Sarnoff didn't like speed bumps. So RCA did what any massive corporate overlord would do. It sent its own engineers to independently create their version of television. Their man, Vladimir Zworykin, a brilliant scientist with impressive credentials and a knack for conveniently timed breakthroughs. He developed a system uncannily similar to Farnsworth's, right down to the way it handled scanning images line by line. When questioned, RCA claimed coincidence. Farnsworth called it corporate déjà vu, and so began one of the most dramatic patent battles in American tech history. Now, courtrooms aren't generally known for being hotbeds of thrilling action, but this one was different. This wasn't just a dry discussion of legal precedents. It was a full-on nerdy showdown, with diagrams flying like daggers and exhibits more dramatic than a telenovela. The crux of Farnsworth's case hinged on one crucial point. Had he really invented the television first? Enter Justin Tolman. You might remember him as Farnsworth's high school science teacher. At this point he was probably enjoying retirement, or at least a life that didn't involve going to court. But when he got the call, he showed up like a chalk-dusted superhero. Because years earlier, in the back of a high school classroom in Rigby, Idaho, Farnsworth had drawn a schematic of his image dissector on a blackboard. Tolman, thinking the kid had a spark, asked if he could keep the drawing, and he did. That yellowing piece of teenage genius became Exhibit A in court. Imagine being in your early 30s and defending your life's work with something you doodled before your first shave. It was awkward, it was beautiful, it was legally bulletproof. The judge examined the drawing, listened to Tolman's testimony, and compared it to RCA's suspiciously similar design. The conclusion? Farnsworth had the original idea. RCA hadn't just built a TV. They had borrowed blueprints without the courtesy of asking. In 1935, the court ruled in Farnsworth's favor. You'd think this would be the happy ending, with Philo hoisted onto shoulders, marching off to enjoy a pile of royalties and a peaceful TV dinner. But RCA wasn't ready to let a mere inventor defeat its fortress of corporate lawyers. They appealed, and when that failed, they appealed again. RCA wasn't trying to win so much as it was trying to exhaust a classic move known in legal circles as bulldozing your opponent until he runs out of money, patience, or both. Farnsworth didn't have a corporate army or Sarnoff's war chest. What he had was persistence and a deeply scientific sense of spite. He kept fighting, kept defending his invention, and with every legal maneuver RCA made, Farnsworth's legend grew. Not just the boy genius, but the man who took on a broadcasting empire armed with nothing but old homework and a remarkably sturdy moral compass. Eventually, RCA relented. Kind of. They agreed to license Farnsworth's patents for a fee. It wasn't a huge amount. It wasn't even a satisfying amount, but it was enough to force RCA to admit defeat, if only on paper. Farnsworth had won the war of innovation, but the war of wealth and recognition, that remained elusive. RCA's media machine buried the Farnsworth name while amplifying Zworykin's contributions. Sarnoff's empire spun the narrative their way, making it seem like RCA had done the heavy lifting while Farnsworth had just tinkered on a tractor. Still, in that courtroom, something important happened. The history of television was clarified, not invented by a boardroom, not snatched from a filing cabinet, but conceived by a teenage mind in a potato field and vindicated by a teacher who'd bothered to save a doodle, because sometimes a great idea doesn't need millions in funding, it just needs someone to believe in it, and maybe a manila folder full of teenage sketches. By the late 1930s, Philo Farnsworth should have been a household name. He had won the patent battle over RCA, outsmarted corporate giants with his teenage sketches, and secured his spot in the history of technology. In a better world, he'd be sipping lemonade under a palm tree while other people argued about antenna alignment. Instead, Farnsworth spent the rest of his life fighting obscurity, struggling to profit from his own invention, and at one point, nearly switching careers entirely. This is the tale of how the man who made television possible got professionally ghosted by the very screen he made. Let's start with the aftermath of his court victory. While the 1935 case technically went in Farnsworth's favor, RCA wasn't in the habit of taking no for an answer, especially not from a quiet farm boy in a lab coat. With the legal equivalent of a passive-aggressive shrug, RCA began to explore every loophole, workaround, and conveniently timed innovation to delay paying out real royalties. Their strategy? Stall, dilute, and adapt. New technologies began to emerge from RCA's labs, similar enough to television to rake in the cash, different enough to avoid writing big checks to Farnsworth. It was the technological equivalent of changing 2 words in your term paper and insisting it's original. The patent was respected, just not honored in the way anyone would hope. By the early 1940s, commercial television was gaining momentum, and RCA was all too happy to market themselves as the pioneer. Meanwhile, Farnsworth was granted royalties, yes, but in amounts so meager that he couldn't exactly buy himself a yacht. He wasn't destitute, but let's just say he was a lot closer to mortgage stress than media mogul. For every $100 RCA made off television's rise, Farnsworth might have gotten pocket change and a thank you note without the note. His PR problem didn't help. Farnsworth wasn't a self-promoter. He didn't enjoy press conferences, didn't hobnob with executives, and definitely didn't hire marketing teams to shout his name from rooftops. He was a lab guy, brilliant, focused, and slightly allergic to schmoozing. Meanwhile, David Sarnoff of RCA practically was a walking press release, and his team had the narrative machine running like clockwork. They weren't just shaping public perception, they were steamrolling it. Even as television sets started appearing in homes, Farnsworth's name was nowhere to be found. RCA's brand was everywhere. RCA became synonymous with TV like Kleenex for tissues or Velcro for hook and loop fasteners. Farnsworth? He might as well have been the guy who installed the antenna. The injustice of it all didn't go unnoticed, at least not by Farnsworth himself. He felt it deeply. Watching television grow into a cultural juggernaut, while being pushed into the background, was like inventing fire and then being told to sit outside while everyone else roasted marshmallows. His frustration grew over the years, and at times he even distanced himself from the very thing he had dreamed up as a boy with a plow in the fields of Utah. At one point, with his television dreams wrung dry by legal fees and corporate gamesmanship, Farnsworth pivoted into nuclear research. That's right, when inventing TV didn't pan out financially, he tried building a fusion reactor instead, because apparently, when Philo Farnsworth has a bad week, he builds the future of energy to cheer himself up. He never stopped dreaming, never stopped inventing, but he never stopped feeling cheated either. It's also worth noting how television's rise dovetailed with global events. The outbreak of World War II put commercial broadcasting on hold, stalling any meaningful rollout of television, and when the war ended, RCA pounced on the post-war boom with a marketing blitz. Farnsworth, by that point, had been edged out of the spotlight. The credit had quietly migrated elsewhere, to the average consumer of the late 1940s and early 1950s. RCA invented TV. Ask your average American who built the glowing box in their living room, and they'd point to the RCA logo, not to a quiet inventor in Utah. For Farnsworth, who had once dreamed that television could educate, inspire, and elevate the masses, it was a bitter pill to swallow, especially when the biggest thing on air was Howdy Doody. Despite this, Farnsworth never turned bitter in public. He didn't go on television talk shows to complain. Ironically, no one invited him. He didn't write a tell-all. He simply kept working, kept thinking, and kept trying to innovate, even if the world had decided to forget his name. In the end, Farnsworth wasn't just a forgotten inventor. He was the classic underdog in a modern myth, the boy genius who won the battle but lost the marketing war. He may not have made millions, but he made something far more lasting, a screen that changed how we see the world, literally. And yes, maybe he should have trademarked his name, signed with an agent, and pitched a show called The Farnsworth Hour. But then again, he was too busy inventing the future. Just as the cathode ray tubes were beginning to hum with promise, and living rooms across America prepared for the glowing box to enter their homes, the world decided to light up another way with gunfire. By the time World War II ignited in full force, Philo T. Farnsworth, our soft-spoken farm boy turned television visionary, watched his pet project shoved aside like an unlabeled can in a wartime pantry. Television would have to wait. Radar was calling. Philo's post-patent career took a sharp left turn. The commercial dreams of bringing television to every household were dashed as governments pivoted all technology development toward military use. Farnsworth, always a tinkerer in search of usefulness, adapted. If you couldn't entertain people, you might as well help save them. Instead of transmitting sitcoms, he started transmitting enemy positions. Farnsworth became involved in classified defense work, lending his inventive mind to the development of radar and infrared detection systems. His work, mostly under contract with the US Navy, contributed to major advances in submarine detection and guided missile systems. You know, just your standard Plan B after inventing television. And let's be clear, this wasn't a simple sidestep. Radar at the time was a fledgling field. and Farnsworth brought to it a deep understanding of how to manipulate electromagnetic waves, skills that had been honed from years of trying to beam images through thin air. He helped develop early versions of image intensifiers and night vision systems. The man had a sixth sense for electronics, and during World War, that sense was directed toward keeping pilots alive and submarines informed, rather than helping couples argue over what to watch. Still, this shift didn't exactly bring Farnsworth fame or fortune. His name wasn't in the newspapers. There were no glossy features in Popular Science showing him in a lab coat posing next to a glowing radar screen. That spotlight was saved for generals, corporate titans, and you guessed it, RCA. While Philo was busy helping win the war behind closed doors, RCA was biding its time. With wartime production dominating resources, the FCC had frozen all new commercial TV licenses. RCA, which had already been stalling the rollout of television to prevent Farnsworth from profiting too much, now had the perfect excuse. And by the time the war ended in 1945, Farnsworth's patents were already beginning to expire like milk in a blackout refrigerator. Meanwhile, RCA emerged from the war smelling like roses and smelling strongly of marketing. Its brand was practically baked into the American psyche, thanks to wartime propaganda films, military radios, and government contracts. David Sarnoff, RCA's chief and eternal thorn in Farnsworth's side, had cleverly positioned the company as both war hero and future maker. It was RCA that had the factories. RCA had the media muscle. RCA had, most importantly, the shelf space. By the time Americans were shopping for televisions in the late 1940s, Farnsworth's name was absent from the brochures. The sets being churned out didn't say inspired by a 14-year-old potato farmer on the box. They said RCA, Zenith, General Electric. All those companies had picked up where Farnsworth left off, sometimes legally, sometimes not quite. It's not that Philo was sitting in a corner sulking. In fact, after the war, he made several attempts to revive his presence in the commercial television space. But by then, the window was narrowing. The money was in mass production and national branding, not solo inventors with expired patents. His dream, the very act of building a device that could beam images across space, was now a billion-dollar industry, but he was watching it through someone else's screen. Perhaps the most stinging part of this era was that television finally began to take off just without him. By the late 1940s, broadcast networks expanded rapidly, programming exploded, and owning a television became the new symbol of modernity. But Farnsworth, the man who sparked it all in his teenage brain while ploughing a field, was nowhere in sight. He had to watch the rise of his invention from the sidelines, like a playwright sitting in the back row of a blockbuster musical and not seeing his name in the playbill. There's a poetic bitterness to it all. The man who had envisioned television before he had facial hair spent the height of its early glory years working on military contracts, peering into sonar screens instead of tuning into the Lone Ranger. He'd made himself essential in war, and then expendable in peace. So when the war ended and America returned to its peacetime fantasies of sitcoms and commercials, Farnsworth wasn't cast as the father of television. He was more like the ghost in the machine, flickering quietly behind the glowing screen, uncredited, but undeniably present. And as RCA cashed in on the post-war TV gold rush, Philo T. Farnsworth went back to his lab, not to compete, but to invent the next thing. Because if history had taught him anything by then, it was that ideas were cheap, but timing and trademark lawyers were everything. Philo T. Farnsworth had always believed that television would change the world. He just didn't realize it would change him too, and not in the feel-good slow-motion montage way. By the 1950s, the teenage genius who had once envisioned line-scanned pictures leaping across the airwaves was watching something else entirely leap, namely, custard pies, right into people's faces. Let's rewind. After surviving the legal meat grinder against RCA, Philo had hoped the world would now open up like a welcoming curtain call. But instead of standing ovations, he got static. His name never became synonymous with his invention. Instead, TV became shorthand for RCA, General Electric, and whatever sponsor was shilling toothpaste during commercial breaks. For the average American family, Farnsworth was just another fuzzy face on a glowing screen they never questioned. By the early 1950s, television had exploded into living rooms across the US, ushering in a new era of entertainment. But the very success of the medium brought a quiet, creeping sorrow for the man who had made it possible. He hadn't envisioned this. His dream was a tool for education, enlightenment, a way to bring the world's museums, libraries, and scientific marvels into every home. What he got was a tap-dancing puppet named Howdy Doody, and sponsors yelling about laundry detergent. Philo wasn't bitter at first. He still held out hope that his invention would evolve. Maybe it just needed time, but as game shows multiplied like gremlins in a rainstorm, and serious programming gave way to sitcoms that recycled the same 3 punchlines in every episode, that hope began to fray. And the money? Not helpful. While RCA eventually paid licensing fees, mostly to avoid another courtroom sequel, those payments trickled in at the financial equivalent of glacial pace. By the time his family saw real checks, inflation had already RVSB'd to their bank account. Television was making millions. But Farnsworth was still trying to keep the lights on, literally, and like many innovators before him, the lack of recognition gnawed at him. The press often credited other names. RCA's marketing machine worked overtime to scrub Farnsworth's role from the public record, spinning a tidy narrative where corporate labs birthed the box in your living room. Journalists were either misinformed or misled. Either way, they didn't call. Neither did the awards committees. With financial strain came emotional weight. Farnsworth, once a hopeful farm boy sketching science fiction with a slide rule, now found himself struggling with depression. He drank more, smiled less. There were days when he couldn't bear to look at the very object he created, not just because of what it had become, but because of what it had taken. That toll wasn't just emotional, it was physical. The constant stress and disappointment wore on him, like static fuzz behind his eyes. His health suffered, his family worried, and yet he never stopped thinking. In the twilight of his career, Farnsworth retreated, not into bitterness, but into science. If television had been the first act of his genius, nuclear fusion would be the encore. Alongside his son and a few loyal engineers, Farnsworth began work on the fusor, a device designed to create nuclear fusion on a small scale. It was the intellectual equivalent of building a star in your garage, just the sort of challenge that appealed to a mind that saw invisible electrons as puzzle pieces. This pivot wasn't just escapism, it was reinvention. Fusion was pure, untouched by network ratings or toothpaste sponsors. It was about solving one of humanity's greatest problems, limitless, clean energy. And for a while it brought him peace. If television had been misused, maybe this new invention could redeem the legacy, or at least remind the world he was still in the lab. Unfortunately, funding ran thin, and while the fusor showed promise, it never fully reached the level of world-changing utility Farnsworth dreamed of. Still, his contributions to fusion research were significant enough that modern scientists still nod to his work when they tinker with reactors. The sadness in Farnsworth's story isn't just that he was ignored, it's that he gave the world something profound, only to have it turned into a punchline. He envisioned a classroom in every living room. Instead, the world got Gilligan's Island. And yet, despite everything, he kept working, even when television turned his dreams into sitcoms, even when his name was wiped from textbooks, even when the world mistook the antenna for the inventor. Farnsworth was a genius, a stubborn, brilliant, quietly tragic genius, and while TV's laugh tracks never paused to thank him, he kept dreaming, because even when history forgets you, physics doesn't. Most people remember July 20, 1969 as the day humanity took its first step on another world. For Philo Farnsworth, it was also the day he got the biggest, most cosmic told you so in the history of inventors. While the world watched in awe as Neil Armstrong descended that lunar ladder, Farnsworth sat in his modest living room with his wife Pem, glued to a glowing television screen. That screen, the device millions used to witness the impossible, was born from the mind of the boy who once stared at potato fields and saw electrons dancing in rows. And in that moment, as Armstrong planted the flag on the moon, Philo turned to Pem and whispered, "This has made it all worthwhile." A line that could have made the credits roll if his life were a movie. Instead, it was the quiet sigh of a man who never sought fame, but who knew finally that the world had seen the full potential of what he built. Let's back up. The Apollo 11 mission wasn't just a feat of rockets and raw nerve. It was a production, and television was the stage. They had spent years preparing to bring the moon landing to the people back home. Engineers at Westinghouse designed a special camera to withstand the lunar surface's temperature extremes and operate in low gravity. But while all that hardware was critical, the transmission technology, the way that image left the moon, beamed to Earth, then into living rooms across America, owed its foundation to Farnsworth's line-scanning genius. Now, if this were a Hollywood tale, the broadcast would have started with "based on a true invention by Philo Farnsworth." But no, by 1969 Farnsworth's name was still largely absent from popular accounts of television's history. RCA had long since cemented itself in the public consciousness as the father of TV. David Sarnoff, who Farnsworth once legally battled like a nerdy David against a corporate Goliath, had become a mogul of mythic proportions. Farnsworth? He was more myth than mogul, known by engineers and historians, sure, but mostly forgotten by the viewers whose lives he had changed. Still, in that moment, watching grainy black and white images of astronauts bounce in lunar dust, he didn't need a plaque or a parade. He knew that the signal riding through the airwaves had once lived in his own brain. It was his electric vision, his painstakingly drawn blueprints, his electron beam scanning method that made it all possible. He had imagined it long before Sarnoff saw a dollar sign or the government saw a propaganda tool. And now the universe had finally caught up. But don't think for a second that this was a neat ribbon-tied ending for Farnsworth. His health was failing by then. Decades of disappointment, stress, and uncredited brilliance had taken a toll. The fusion projects he pursued in his later years had stalled. Recognition was slow, royalties were microscopic, and television, his baby, had turned into a neon fire hose of sitcoms and cereal ads. There's no evidence he was bitter on that July day, but it's hard not to imagine some flicker of irony flicking across his tired eyes. The thing he created to uplift humanity had, at times, seemed to be its sedative. And yet here it was, bringing the moon into every kitchen, living room and dive bar on Earth. Let's also talk about Pem. Philo's wife wasn't just watching history, she was history. She had been there when the first television image was successfully transmitted. She had taken notes, done calculations, and kept the lab running during the leanest, bleakest years. If Farnsworth was the brain, Pem was the beating heart that kept the dream alive through patent wars and emotional low points. That he turned to her with such a profound statement, "This has made it all worthwhile," speaks volumes. Not just about the moon or the invention, but about the quiet partnership behind every great breakthrough. Ironically, the Apollo broadcast that meant so much to Farnsworth was itself imperfect. Signal dropouts, grainy resolution, odd lighting. Television was still wrestling with its own limitations, but none of that mattered. The image came through. People saw it. A human being had walked on the moon, and millions had seen it happen in real time. That connection, the ability to see something as it happened thousands of miles away, was the core of what Farnsworth envisioned as a teenager. It was no longer a dream or a sketch in a high school notebook. It was real. It was historic. And it was powered by the brain of a man who never gave up on the signal. So no, Philo Farnsworth didn't live to see his name in flashing lights. He didn't get to host a late-night show or cut a ribbon at a grand unveiling. But he got something better. He got proof that his idea had not only worked, it had shaped the way the world understood itself. The moon landing wasn't just a triumph of space exploration. It was a triumph of imagination, stubbornness, and a teenage farm kid from Utah who looked at furrows in the dirt and saw the future. The cathode ray tubes may have flickered, the recognition may have lagged, but for one shining moment the universe sent a picture back home, and somewhere in that fuzzy lunar transmission was a quiet, undeniable nod to the man who made it all possible. Philo Farnsworth died in 1971, just months after watching men walk on the moon via a device he dreamed up as a teenager. He passed away quietly, without much fanfare. No front-page tributes, no ticker-tape parades, no retrospective specials on, ironically, the very invention that made it all possible. His name didn't trend. Then again, the internet didn't exist. But even if it had, it's unlikely Philo T. Farnsworth would have gone viral. And yet he had actually done it. Let's not forget, this was the farm boy who saw lines in a potato field and turned them into the building blocks of broadcast technology. The teenager who built cathode ray tubes in his garage while most kids were still figuring out how shoelaces work. The man who defended his vision in court using a high school sketch, and despite being underfunded, overwhelmed, and routinely outmaneuvered by corporate behemoths, he still managed to push the world into the age of electronic media. But if you blinked, you missed it. While RCA and its media titan David Sarnoff built entire empires of entertainment, Farnsworth remained a footnote. He moved between modest labs, chasing scientific dreams and, eventually, nuclear fusion. Recognition was rare, money was rarer. By the time he died of pneumonia at the age of 64, television was in nearly every household, but few households knew who to thank. Still, history has a long memory, and time is kinder than press releases. In the years following his death, a slow but steady rehabilitation of Farnsworth's legacy began. Scholars, historians, and engineers started to look beyond the RCA press kits and rediscovered the dusty blueprints, the early patents, and that infamous high school notebook drawing that helped win the legal war. Bit by bit, Farnsworth's name returned to the conversation, not as a curiosity, but as a cornerstone. Today, his contribution is acknowledged in museums, textbooks, and the annals of electrical engineering. In 2007, Time magazine named him one of the 100 most important people of the 20th century. Statues of him stand in both the US Capitol and his home state of Utah. The boy who once fiddled with vacuum tubes in a shed is now celebrated alongside the likes of Edison, Tesla, and Bell. And for good reason. Farnsworth didn't just invent television, he foresaw its potential. He believed it could educate, inspire, connect. He imagined a world where images could leap through the air, uniting people across continents. Sure, he didn't predict reality TV or 3 a.m. mattress sales, but he understood something more fundamental, that seeing could be a shared experience, that light and signal could become culture. But Farnsworth's story isn't just about the invention, it's about the cost of being ahead of your time. He battled giants, he lost sleep and money, he suffered through obscurity while others cashed in. His life is a reminder that innovation doesn't always come with confetti. Sometimes it comes with courtroom transcripts, legal appeals, and years of thankless tinkering. In a way, Farnsworth's journey is the ultimate underdog tale with a bittersweet twist. He won, but only after history took its sweet time realizing it. His life warns us that genius alone isn't enough. Without visibility, without champions, without a little bit of luck, even world-changing brilliance can get pixelated into oblivion. Still, maybe it's poetic that the man who invented the moving image didn't get his own spotlight right away. Maybe his legacy is stronger because it had to survive without marketing. In the end, we owe him every documentary, every sitcom, every viral cat video, every breaking news ticker, every World Cup goal, every movie night. We owe him the ability to see the world without leaving the couch. Philo Farnsworth gave us a screen, but more importantly, he gave us a way to see. And while he may have passed away largely unknown, today, his story beams silently through every flickering pixel.